Let us now discuss the nervous system. So we are now in chapter 8. The nervous system is the most complex system of the body because it involved in some way in nearly every body functions. Yet it is very conservative in terms of change. The nervous system determines responses of the body to changes in internal and external environment. So we can consider the nervous system as a communication system, receiving signals from and receiving signals from and sending commands to different areas of the body because we consider it as parang control center natin. By way of this communication, the nervous system helps to coordinate the body functions to maintain homeostasis. So, kumu-coordinate itong nervous system para ma-maintain yung homeostasis or what we call yung equilibrium or balance. Now, let us look at some major functions of the nervous system. The first one here, just like what we have mentioned, is yung receiving sensory input. Sensory receptors monitor numerous external and internal stimuli. We are aware of sensations from some stimuli. Aware tayo. Such as, for example, yung vision, hearing, taste, smell, touch, pain, body position, and temperature. Other stimuli such as, for example, yung blood pH, yung blood gases, and blood pressure are also being processed at a subconscious level. So that is in the receiving sensory input. Next is the nervous system and is integrating information. It integrates information. The brain and spinal cord are the major organs for processing sensory input and initiating responses. Ito yung sila yung naga-integrate na information, yung brain at saka yung spinal cord. The input may produce an immediate response. So, pwede yung, ang gagawin pag naka-receive na information, ang brain at saka spinal cord, the input may produce an immediate response. So, magkakaroon ka agad ng immediate yung response or pwede rin ito siya na ma-stored as memory or pwede rin na i-ignore. No? Pwedeng i-ignore yung mga responses. Next is controlling muscles and glands. Skeletal muscles normally contract only when stimulated by the nervous system. Nag-contract lang siya because of the stimulation of the nervous system. Thus, by controlling skeletal muscle, the nervous system controls the major movements of the body. So, siya yung nag-control ng mga major movements ng katawan. The nervous system also participates in controlling cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and many glands. So, yun siya yung nag-control. Next is the nervous system is also involved in maintaining homeostasis. The nervous system plays an important role in maintaining homeostasis. This function depends on the nervous system's ability to detect, interpret, and respond to changes in internal and external conditions. In response, the nervous system can stimulate or inhibit the activities of other systems to help maintain a constant internal environment. So yung nervous system na yon, pwede niyang i-stimulate or i-inhibit or stop yung mga activities ng other systems para lang na ma-maintain yung constant internal environment. So siya yung pwedeng mag-control doon. Lastly, establishing and maintaining mental activity. The brain is the center of mental activity. Okay? Including yung consciousness, memory, and thinking. So yung part ng nervous system na yan, yung brain, is the center of that mental activity. So tingnan natin ngayon yung divisions of the nervous system. Divisions of the nervous systems or the central nervous system or the CNS. So dalawa ang divisions. So there are the nervous system can be divided into two major divisions, the CNS or the central nervous system and the PNS or the peripheral nervous system. CNS consists of the brain and spinal cords, while the PNS consists of all the nervous tissue outside the CNS. So yung lahat ng ng mga nervous tissue outside the CNS. It includes the nerves and the ganglia. So for example, the cranial nerve and the spinal nerves, yun siya are the peripheral nervous system. The sensory division of the PNS transmits action potential to the CNS. Yung sensory division, meron siyang sensory division doon sa PNS kasi 'di ba siya ay mga nerves siya. So whatever yung nasa-sense doon, itatransmit niya yung action potential to the CNS. That is for the sensory division. Pag na-sense niya from the PNS going to the CNS, that is sensory division. The motor division carries action potential away from the CNS. So if it will act naman motor in response to the sensory, so away from the CNS. Magpalayo naman siya sa CNS. The motor division is divided into somatic and autonomic system. The somatic nervous system innervates skeletal muscle and is mostly under voluntary control. When we say innervates, meaning to say that it supplies with the nerve, yung somatic doon sa may skeletal muscle, and is mostly under voluntary control. Ang autonomic nervous system innervates cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and gland, and is mostly under involuntary control. Again, going back, we have the sensory division and we have the motor division. And under sa motor division, we have somatic at saka autonomic. Kung somatic, doon siya sa mga nag-supply with nerve doon sa skeletal muscle, which is voluntary. Autonomic is innervates siya sa cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And of course, it is mostly under involuntary control. The autonomic nervous system is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Okay? Parasympathetic at saka sympathetic divisions. In the later part, tingnan natin ano yung sympathetic at saka ano yung parasympathetic na division. The enteric nervous system contains both. So we have also another nervous system, the enteric. Enteric nervous system contains both sensory and motor neurons. Meron silang sensory at saka motor na neurons, which can function independently of the CNS. So kahit itong enteric without the CNS, it can just function independently, yung enteric nervous system. So tingnan natin yan mamaya. So this is now the nervous system, the division of the nervous system. You have here your CNS or the central nervous system, which is yung kanyang is the brain and the spinal cord. So yan siya. Okay? And for our PNS or the peripheral nervous system, ito na siya. Lahat ng mga nerves na ito, okay? Even sa mga cranial nerves. So nerves to face, ganglia. So we have, it includes, ang ganglia is included in the PNS. Nerves to upper limb, nerves to lower limb. So lahat ng mga nerves na yan is PNS. So meaning, all the nervous tissue which is outside the CNS. So kung ito, CNS, ito siya, the brain and the spinal cord, lahat ng mga nerves na yan is the PNS or the peripheral nervous system. So this is now the division. Yung kanina na tingnan na natin ito sa central nervous system. Ang CNS, ito yung CNS, this one is the PNS. So kasi yung PNS, 'di ba? Nag-ano lang ito siya, nag-circulate within the, kasi siya ay mga ano siya, peripheral siya, 'di ba? Siya yung mga nerves ending ng outside sa CNS. So mag-connect siya from the endings outside of the CNS. Ang CNS natin is the brain and the spinal cord. Ang peripheral nervous system natin, yung mga receptors, mga nerves, ganglia, plexuses. So under sa CNS natin, we have the sensory division, and then we have the motor division. As you can see here, ang arrow, yun ganyan, papunta yung under sa sensory division, going to, from the PNS going to the CNS. Ang motor division is from CNS going out, no, away from the CNS. For example, sensory input, nagkakaroon ka ng sensory. So saan ito siya mangyayari? Of course, dito sa my peripheral nervous system, you have the receptors there sa my PNS. So for example, light, sound, taste, smell, touch, temperature, pain, pressure, etc. So pagkakaroon, na-receive na siya ng sensory receptors, okay? It will be received by the sensory receptors. It will proceed to the sensory division, okay? In the sensory division, ipaano niya dito, interpret niya doon papunta ng CNS. Ano ba yung kanyang input na sensory? So whatever it is, ang motor division is ipagawa niya na kung ano yung kailangan in the motor division. Okay? So, ang motor division, or we also call this one as efferent division. Efferent meaning to say a way of the PNS, and it will conduct, in here, it will conduct action potentials from the CNS. So kung ma-remember ninyo sa ating homeostasis, meron doong effector. So from the control center, ang control center, it will allow the CNS to effector organs, for example. Such as, for example, ang muscle, ang glands, kung ano yung dapat niya i-response, okay, sa motor division. And under the motor division, malalaman natin, ano ba ito, somatic ba siya or autonomic na nervous system? Ano ba ang dapat niya na i-response? Just like what I have mentioned kanina, di ba? Kung somatic nervous system siya, it will conduct actions potential from CNS to skeletal muscles. Di ba ito siya? Ang naman, pag autonomic nervous system naman ito siya, ang transmission of action potentials to the cardiac, the smooth muscle, okay? The cardiac muscles and the glands. So yun siya yung kanyang gagawin. So i-consider niya whether it's a sympathetic or a parasympathetic. So kung sympathetic division siya, it involves in preparing the body for stress-related activities. Ang parasympathetic naman, it will be associated with returning the body to routine, day-to-day operations, yung sa autonomic nervous system. Then, effectors here, ang cardiac at saka smooth muscle and the glands. Then, kung halimbawa, somatic nervous, ang effectors, of course, is the skeletal muscle. And, ang motor input, ang gagawin niya? So, syempre, mag-move siya, movement, changes in metabolism, heart rate, breathing rate, etc. Yun ang magiging response. So, kung ano yung Ano yung na-receive natin dito sa sensory input is under siya sa sensory division. Ano yung magiging action niya will be the under sa motor division. So that's why away siya sa central nervous system. The sensory division of the peripheral nervous system, which is the green, detects stimuli, conducts action potential to the CNS. The CNS interprets, so interpret niya, incoming action potentials and initiates action potentials that are conducted through the motor division, which is ito na, to produce responses. The motor division is divided into somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So this is the divisions of the nervous system. So syempre, kung nanggaling, papunta man siya or nanggaling man siya sa nervous system, yung kanyang pathway is dadaan siya talaga sa mga nerves, no? So meaning sa peripheral nervous system. Yun ang kanyang dinadaanan. Cells of the nervous system. Let us now look at the cells of the nervous systems. Ano-ano ang mga cells sa nervous system? So we have the neurons, the glial cells, and the myelin sheaths. No, myelin sheaths. Neurons. Neurons, or we call this one as the nerve cells. Neurons or the nerve cells receive stimuli, nag-receive siya ng stimuli, and conduct action potentials. And transmit signals to other neurons or effector organs. So, nag-conduct siya ng action potentials. So, syempre, pag mag-conduct siya ng action potential, the neurons will transmit signals to other neurons. A neuron has 3 parts. 3 part. It consists of a cell body and 2 types of processes, which what we call the dendrites and the axon. Each neuron cell body contains a single nucleus. So, bawat cell body ng neuron, meron lang siyang isang single na nucleus. So, mamaya tingnan natin sa ating figure. And, as with any other cell, so, di ba yung mga napag-aralan natin ng cell, no? Usually, typical cell. Makikita natin dito na yung structure ng neurons compared to usually na dinidiscuss natin na typical cell, makikita natin ang structure niya is iba. As with any other cell, the nucleus of the neuron is the source of information for gene expression. So, ang nucleus ng neuron is for the gene expression. And extensive rough endoplasmic reticulum or the RER, a Golgi apparatus, or just imagine yung cell na mga organelles, and mitochondria surround the nucleus. Rough ER, the Golgi apparatus, and the mitochondria surround the nucleus of that cell body ng neurons. Large numbers of neurofilaments, the intermediate filaments, and microtubules organize the cytoplasm into distinct areas. So doon sa cell body, nandoon yung nucleus and surrounded by, yung nucleus ng cell body surrounded by mga organelles, specifically the rough ER, the Golgi apparatus, and the mitochondria. The next part of the neuron is the dendrites. And dendrites are short, often highly branched cytoplasmic extensions. Okay, mamaya na. So, dendrites are short, often, okay, tingnan natin yan mamaya sa figure. Dendrites, highly branching cytoplasmic extension. that are tapered from their base at the neuron cell body to their tips. Most dendrites are extensions of the neuron cell body. Yung extension siya ng neuron cell body. But dendrite-like structures also project from the peripheral ends of some sensory axons. Dendrites usually receive information from the neurons or from sensory receptors and transmit the information toward the neuron cell body. So, ito siya ang dendrites. Ito na lang ipakita ko na. Typical neuron, structural features of typical motor neuron in the PNS include a cell body and two types of cell processes. Ano yung cell processes again? This one, the dendrites. Ito yung dendrites. So, this one here is the neuron cell body. Ito siya buo. As you can see here, just like what I have mentioned, this is now your nucleus. Okay? Siyempre, ang nucleus, meron siyang nucleolus. Then, the Golgi apparatus, it has the mitochondria, then the rough ER. So, pag sinabi nating rough ER, it has a ribosome attached to it. Okay? So, this is the neuron cell body. Dendrites, okay, yun na yung dimension ko kanina, which is short lang siya and are highly branching into cytoplasmic extension. Di ba ito yung cytoplasmic? So, cytoplasm niya. So, parang nag-branch off siya. Yun siya, ang extension niya is the dendrites. Okay, yan. So, ang dendrites, usually, itong dendrites na ito usually receive information from the neurons or from the sensory receptors. Sila yung nagka-receive, okay, ng sensory receptors. And it also transmit the information toward the neuron cell body. So, kung halimbawa naka-receive sila ng information, itatransmit nila toward the cell body, ang sa may dendrites. So, dito naman tingnan natin itong axon. So, this is the axon here. Okay? Each neuron has an axon. So, ang bawat neuron, meron siyang axon. A single long cell process. Okay, so it is a single long cell process extending from the neuron cell body. Galing dito sa neuron cell body. Okay? The area, nag-extend siya from the neuron cell body. So, yan siya, axon. So, mga axon yan siya. Okay? The areas where the axon lives, the neuron cell body is called the axon hillock. So, di ba ito? This is what we call axon hillock. Before, this is our cell body. Before yung isang axon talaga, okay, where axon leaves the neuron cell body, okay, pag mag-leave na siya sa cell body, it is, first, you have there your axon hillock. So, this is your axon now. Each axon has a uniform diameter. Meron silang diameter, uniform yung diameter ng bawat axon. Okay, sa isang axon, uniform ang diameter and may vary in length pero ang length nila mag-vary. Pwede siyang from a few millimeters, okay, yung kanyang length, from a few millimeters to more than a meter. So, pwede siyang sobra pa sa 1 metro. Axons of sensory neurons conduct action potentials. Okay? Towards the CNS, papunta ng CNS. Okay? Going to the CNS. And axons of motor neurons conduct action potentials away from the CNS. So, away from the CNS, ang sensory is towards the CNS. Ang axon also conduct action potentials from one part of the brain or spinal cord to another part. Itong axon. An axon may remain unbranched or may branch to form collateral action. So, pwedeng nag-remain siya na wala siyang branch. So, diretso-diretso lang siya. Pero kung nagkaroon na siya ng branch, yung kanyang branch, we call that one as a collateral axon. Axons can be surrounded by a highly specialized insulating layer of cells. Okay? Insulating layers of cell, ito siya. It can be surrounded by that, which is what we call myelin sheaths. Formed by the Schwann cells. Okay? So this is the Schwann cells. Okay? And this is yung naga-surround dito, naga-insulate na cell is the myelin sheath. Myelin sheath, no? Baka kasi ulit ko baka kasi sabihin niyo bad words. So sheath. Next is later tingnan natin in this chapter kung ano yung mga itong myelin sheaths at saka Schwann cell, no? And di ba ang connections between the tawag nito one axon to another, no? This is what you call the node of Ranvier. In here, this is the presynaptic terminals na, ang end ng dito sa dulo ng ating neurons. Ang neurons, there are types of neurons we will consider. The body's neurons vary in function and in structure. So yung body as you can see here, iba-iba yung body ng neurons. So, kung iba-iba yung body ng neurons, it will also vary yung kanyang functions. Siyempre, yung structure niya, from the structure, we will know na iba siya sa ibang mga neurons. So, there are types of neurons. As such, neurons can be classified on the basis of their function. So, depende yun sa kanilang function as well as their structure. For example, referring to a neurons as sensory neuron. So, alam mo, sinabi nating sensory neuron indicates that it is carrying information to the CNS. Kung sensory siya, di ba, magdala siya ng information papunta ng CNS. Pinaulit-ulit natin ito ha. Neuron, sensory, neuron going to the CNS. Pero kung motor naman siya away from the CNS. So it indicates carrying information to the CNS from the body. So nagaling sa body going to the central nervous system. And for example, yung neuron as a motor neuron, syempre, it will indicate it is sending information to the body from the CNS. So galing doon sa CNS, pupunta doon sa body. However, neurons are distinguished from one another on the basis of their structure. Makita din natin based on their structure. In the structural classification, 3 categories of neurons exist. So, mayroong 3 categories as what you can see sa ating figure. Based on the arrangement of their processes. Ano yung processes? The dendrite and the axon. Most of the neurons within the CNS and nearly all motor neurons are multipolar. So, ito yung itsura ng multipolar neuron, has many dendrites and axon. Okay? And an axon, isang axon, tapos marami siyang dendrites. Nakita mo yan, oh. So that is your dendrites. As we can see here, nakalimutan ko kanina, no, pagpakita dito. So as you can see here, di ba usually ang ating cell na ginadrawing bilog, tapos nucleus, tapos mga organelles. Pero ito, this is another type of the structure ng cell, ang neuron. Again, going back here, a multipolar neurons has many dendrites. Ito siya. And again, just like what I have mentioned, most of the multineurons na dendrite and multineurons are involved in motor, no? Motor neurons. So yung mga motor neurons natin, meaning ang motor neurons is from the CNS away from the CNS, going to the cell body. So, ganito usually yung kanilang structure ng neuron na yan. Then, bipolar neuron has a dendrite and an axon. Meron din siyang dendrite. Ito lang yung dendrite niya. Unlike with this one, sa multipolar neuron, so marami siyang dendrite. You have that dendrite and the axon. Have two processes, one dendrite and one axon lang. One dendrite, one axon. Ang bipolar neurons are located in some sensory organs. So, sa ibang mga sensory organs, nakalocate itong bipolar na neurons, such as in the retina of the eye and in the nasal cavity. So, meron siyang bipolar neuron doon. Most other sensory neurons are this one here. We call this one as a pseudo-unipolar neuron. Appears to have an axon and no dendrites. As you can see, wala siyang dendrites. So, you have the axon. Ito na yung axon branches function as a single axon. No, nag-branch siya. Pero this one na ang kanyang sensory receptors. So, this process divides into two processes as a short distance from the cell body. Short distance lang siya sa cell body ito. One process extends to the periphery. Nag-extend siya sa periphery. And the other extends to the CNS. The two extensions function as a single axon with small dendrite-like sensory. So parang dendrite-like lang siya, no, yung kanyang sensory receptors at the periphery. The axon receives sensory information at the periphery and transmits that information in the form of action potential to the CNS. So these are the different types of neurons. Next, another cell of the nervous system aside from the neurons is the glial cells. Glial cells are the support cells of the nervous system. Mga support cells sila ng nervous system. They include astrocytes, ependymal cells, microglia, oligodendrocytes, and Schwann cells. Ito yung mga part ng glial cells. Or we call this glial cell also as the neuroglia. Neuroglia, which is also what we call the nerve glue, parang glue. Because these glial cells are the supportive cells. So just like what is written there, supportive cells siya ng both ng CNS and PNS. Meaning, these cells do not conduct action potentials. Hindi siya nag-conduct ng action potential. Instead, ang glial cells carry out different functions that enhance neuron function. Ini-enhance niya lang yung neuron functions and maintain normal conditions within the nervous system. The glial cell or the neuroglia are far more numerous than neurons. Mas marami sila kaysa compare sa neurons. Most neuroglia or glial cells retain the ability to divide, whereas neurons do not. Nag-divide pa itong neuroglia or the glial cell. Kasi yung neurons, yun na yun. So pag masira ang isang neurons, mamatay, hindi na siya ma-replace. While the glial cells, kasi nag-divide siya. The types of glial cells are different in the CNS versus the PNS. So, ang type ng glial cell, depende siya kung sa CNS ba siya or sa PNS. Kasi di ba supporting na cell siya. Okay? In the CNS, there are 4 types of glial cell. So, sa CNS, merong 4 na glial cell. The astrocyte, the ependymal cells, microglia, at saka oligodendrocytes. Ito yung type ng mga cells ng CNS. So there is only one PNS glial cell type, which is i-discuss dito sa chapter na ito. Okay, which is yung Schwann cells sa may PNS na yan. Astrocytes, so itong astrocyte na ito, ano ba itong kanyang ginagawa? The astrocytes of glial cells serve as the major supporting cells in the CNS. Siya yung nag-support talaga sa CNS. In this role, astrocytes can stimulate or inhibit the signaling activity of nearby neurons. So, pwede niyang i-inhibit or stop or pwede niyang i-stimulate. In addition, astrocytes participate with the blood vessel endothelium to form a permeability barrier called blood-brain barrier between the blood and the CNS. Astrocytes help limit damage to neural tissue. However, the repair process can form a scar that blocks regeneration of damaged axons. Kasi 'di ba help siya, ang glial cell pwede siyang pwede siyang tawag nito, mag-regenerate. So, ito siya yung makatulong in the repair process. In the ependymal cells, ano itong ependymal cells of the CNS? Okay, ependymal cells, ependymal cells line the fluid-filled cavity. Siya yung nag-align sa fluid-filled cavities, the ventricles and canals. Okay, tingnan natin mamaya, within the CNS. Some ependymal cells produce cerebrospinal fluid, and others with cilia in the surface help move the cerebrospinal fluid through the CNS. And we have the microglia. Ang microglia in the CNS act as an immune cells of the CNS. So when we say immune, meaning ang microglia help protect the brain by removing bacteria and cell debris. So for example, merong mga bacteria particular na nakapasok, it will be the function of the microglia to protect the brain by removing that bacteria and even the cell debris. And lastly, ang ating oligodendrocyte, it provides an insulating material that surrounds axon in the neuron, no? So yun siya ang Schwann cell, which is in the PNS, the glial cell known as the Schwann cell. Nakita natin kanina, provide insulating material around axons. No, nakita natin kanina doon. So we have here, ito yung Schwann cell. Nag-provide siya ng insulation sa axon ng PNS. Next is the myelin sheaths. Myelin sheaths are specialized layers that wrapped around the axons. Wrapped around the axon or some neurons. These myelin sheaths are formed by the cell processes of the glial cells. Specifically, myelin sheaths are formed by oligodendrocytes in the CNS and Schwann cells in the PNS. So, na-form yun siya kung sa CNS doon sa oligodendrocytes, pero dito naman sa may PNS doon sa may Schwann cell. So, tingnan natin dito sa ating figure. So, ang ating figure, ito. These are the types of glial cell. Balik muna ako dito ha. So, ang myelin sheaths, axons are either unmyelinated or myelinated. Dalawa lang siya. Axon with these myelin sheaths are called myelinated kung meron siyang myelin. No? Unmyelinated, walang myelin. Okay? So, this one here, sa type ng glial cells ha, kasi di ba siya i-support lang yung glial cell. Astrocytes. So, this is an astrocyte with foot processes surrounding a blood capillary. Okay? So, this is astrocyte, no? So, this is the blood capillary. Meron siyang foot, okay? Foot processes, ito siya. So, the foot processes. So, this is the foot processes, which naga-surround sa blood capillary. So, if this is your capillary, may naga-surround doon na foot ng, foot processes ng astrocyte. This one here, ito naman, this is ependymal cells with cilia extending from the surface. No, naga-extend. So, ependymal cells, naga-extend siya doon sa surface. This one is, ito yung itsura ng microglial cells. Ito yung naga-help protect ng ating CNS. Okay, you have this one. This is the body. Okay. Cell body of the microglial cell. Dito naman, so you compare yung itsura niya. So this is now the oligodendrocyte. Oligodendrocyte, naga-forming a myelin sheath around parts of 3 axons. So meron siyang 3 axon, okay? So this one axon. So naga-form ng myelin sheath. This is, yung dyan, ang connection is the node of Rainver. No? Sa nodes of Rainver. Ano yung node of Rainver? This is gaps in myelin sheath. Yung node ng Ranvier. Okay, gaps ng mga myelin sheath. But of course, ito na yung ating Schwann cell, forming part of the myelin sheaths of the axon in the PNS. So for example, this one, ito yung Schwann cell natin. Di ba ito yung myelin sheath? So axon, cover siya ng myelin sheath. So this one becomes the cytoplasm. Ito yung cytoplasm ng ating Schwann cell. And the nucleus of the Schwann cell. So Schwann cell na yan siya. Okay? So tingnan natin, i-compare natin yung myelinated and unmyelinated axons. So this one is myelinated axon. So kung myelinated axon siya, ito yon. Ang Schwann cell, ito na yung sa Schwann cell niya. Ang myelin sheath niya, ito na, the nucleus. Then you have the cytoplasm and axon. Pero kung unmyelinated, ito yung kanyang nucleus, di ba? Pero kung unmyelinated, makikita natin, ito na yung kanyang nucleus agad with the cytoplasm. Tapos, Schwann cell na yan siya. Then you have the nucleus at the center ng the cytoplasm. And axons is nandoon sa palibot ng nucleus ng Schwann cell. Node of Ranvier, no myelin sheath. Ang node of Ranvier, wala siyang myelin sheath. Okay, myelinated axon with two Schwann cells forming part of the myelin. Kasi di ba ang axon, diretso lang man yan siya. Yung Ranvier, yun siya yung node of Ranvier, naga-separate sa isang, isang Schwann cell, then another Schwann cell. So each Schwann cell surrounds part of one axon. Unmyelinated axons with two Schwann cells surrounding several axons in parallel formation. Each Schwann cell surrounds part of several axons. So that's it. Let us look at first the cells of the nervous system. So these are the cells of the nervous system going back. So we have the neuron, the glial cells of the CNS, the glial cells of the PNS. So we have the astrocytes for glial cells, the epididymal cells, microglia, at saka oligodendrocytes. So these are the table. This is the table for the cells of the nervous system. You can see here the type of cell with its description and its function. So I will leave it to you to further study this table. Kasi nandito naman yun siya. Ang ating table, makikita natin dito kung ano yung mga description niya at saka function. So you will have your also assignment to do by reading this table. Okay? So that's it. Let's look at now the organization of nervous system. Nervous system, nervous tissue, organization of nervous tissue. Nervous tissue consists of white matter and gray matter. So meron siyang white at saka gray matter. The nervous tissue varies in color. Nag-vary siya ng color due to the location and arrangement of the parts of the neurons and glial cells. Nervous tissue exists as gray matter and white matter. So pag sinabi natin gray matter consists of groups of neuron cell bodies. Group siya ng neuron cell bodies and their dendrites. That is for the gray. Where there is very little myelin. Konti lang yung myelin. In CNS or in the central nervous system, gray matter on the surface of the brain is called the cortex. Okay, tandaan niyo yung gray matter ng CNS sa brain is what we call yung cortex. So gray matter form the cortex. And cluster of gray matter located deeper within the brain. So yung nakalocate within the brain, that is what we call the nuclei. So nuclei in the brain are the gray matter which is deeper within the brain. And similarly, the PNS, meron ding gray matter in the PNS. Meron ding gray matter sa may PNS. Okay? Ganglia in the PNS. In PNS, a cluster of neuron cell bodies is called ganglion. Okay? Ganglion. Or plural niya, ganglia. Parang swelling or a knot. So white matter consists of bundles of parallel axons with their myelin sheaths, which are whitish in color. Kaya siya white matter. White matter of the CNS form nerve tracts. Yung white matter ng CNS. So makita natin yan mamaya pag makita natin yung anatomical structure. Or ang nerve tracts, or we call that one as conduction pathways, which propagate action potentials from one area of the CNS to another. White matter of PNS consists of bundles of axons and associated connective tissue that form nerves. So white matter forms nerve tracts in the CNS and nerves in the PNS. Let's proceed now to the electrical signal and neural pathways. Electrical signals and neural pathways. We will discuss the resting membrane potentials, action potentials, the synapse, the reflexes, and the neuronal pathways. So let's start with the resting membrane potential. Our resting membrane potential results from the charge difference across the membrane of the cell. If you recall, sa ating discussion doon sa resting membrane potential, pag nag-rest siya, yung positive at saka negative, the sodium ion outside and potassium ion inside. Okay? Nag-maintain sila ng resting. So the resting membrane potential is set by leak ion channels and the sodium-potassium pump. We have already discussed that one in chapter 7. So this one, the generation of the resting membrane potential. The resting membrane potential results from differences in the concentration of ions across the membrane and the permeability characteristics of the membrane. As we can see here, actually, naano naman natin ito last time, the resting. In a resting cell, there is a higher concentration of potassium inside the cell membrane and a higher concentration in the sodium outside the cell membrane. So yung pink na yan is the sodium, ang purple na yan is the potassium. Because the membrane is not permeable to negatively charged proteins, yung mga green na yan, negatively charged proteins yan siya. They are isolated to inside of the cell membrane. There are more potassium leak channels than sodium leak channels. In the resting cell, only the leak channels are open. Okay, itong mga leak channel, sila lang yung opened. Because, the gated channels, not shown, hindi pinakita dito ang gated, are closed. Because of the ion concentration differences across the membrane, potassium diffuses out. So nag-diffuse out ang potassium of the cell down its concentration gradient. The tendency of potassium to diffuse out of the cell is opposed by the tendency of the positively charged potassium to be attracted back into the cell by the negative charge inside the cell. And in here, the sodium-potassium pump helps maintain the differential levels of sodium potassium by pumping 3 sodium out. So ipapump niya ang, kung may nakapasok na sodium dito, ipapump niya 3 sodium palabas. Okay? In exchange for 2, so 3 sodium palabas, and in exchange 2 potassium into the cell. The pump is driven by ATP hydrolysis. The resting membrane potential is established when the movement of potassium out of the cell is equal to the movement of potassium into the cell. So, kung nag-resting, membrane, resting, in the resting. But once it will proceed to action potential. So, siya ng action potential? Action potential occurs when the charge across the cell membrane is briefly reversed. So, na-reverse siya. Di ba ito yung sodium dito, marami sodium sa labas, ang sa loob potassium. Pero pag na-reverse yan siya, meaning to say, there is that what we call yung action potential. Chemically gated and voltage gated ion channels generate the action potential. Okay? So ito siya, voltage gated ion channels and the action potentials. Ito siya, step 1 illustrates the status of voltage-gated sodium and potassium ion channels in resting cell. So, naka-rest ito na cell. Okay? Yung voltage-gated na mga channels, ion channels, naka-close pa yan siya. And step 2, now in here, and 3, for example, the 2 and 3 na steps show how channels open and close to produce an action potential. Next to each step, a graph. So we have here the graph. Shows in red the membrane potential. Ito, membrane potential siya. Resulting from the condition of the ion channels. For example, in here, this is the membrane potential, nasa resting pa siya. Di ba wala siyang walang may nangyari. Okay? But once na-depolarize siya, okay, there is that depolarization, ang action potential is, as you can see here, the membrane potential, umakyat siya. Okay? And once nag-repolarize, kasi babalik siya ulit into resting, okay, nag-repolarize siya, you can see here, the resting potential membrane. So, yan ang nangyayari sa action potentials. So, action potential, once a local potential reaches threshold, yung pinaka-threshold niya, an all or non-action potential is started. So, pwedeng wala o merong action potential ang mag-start. During depolarization, pag depolarize niya, okay, depolarized phase, the voltage across the cell membrane changes from approximately negative 70 millivolts to approximately papunta doon sa may 20 millivolts. So that is during the depolarization. In the during the repolarization phase, the voltage across the cell membrane, yung voltage niya across the cell membrane returns to negative, babalik siya dito sa may negative 70 millivolts. There is a brief period of hyperpolarization at the end of repolarization. Merong hyper. Medyo baba masyado siya na polarization. Before siya returns to its resting membrane potential. So the entire process lasts 1 to 2 milliseconds. So milliseconds lang ito nangyayari. Yung biglang kakaroon ng reverse, no? Yung positive at saka negative, yung sodium-potassium na exchange. It's milliseconds. Then balik ka agad siya sa resting phase. Continuous. So let us look at this one. This is continuous conduction in unmyelinated axon. Unmyelinated meaning wala yung myelin sheaths. During continuous conduction, an action potential in one part of the cell membrane causes local currents in the adjacent membrane which produce an action potential. So, di ba ito siya? So, this is in the axon. Okay? Outside of the membrane becomes negative. Inside of the membrane becomes positive. Supposed to be, exchange na siya. In here, this one here, ito pinapakita. Okay? An action potential, ito yung action potential, orange part of the membrane, generates local currents that depolarize the membrane immediately adjacent to the action potential. Okay? Yun siya, makikita ninyo. Oh. Di ba dapat positive, pero bigla siyang nagkaroon ng action potential. So in here, as you can see, nagkakaroon ng positive na ang sa loob, negative na sa labas. Okay? Then in here, as when depolarization caused by the local currents reaches threshold, a new action potential is produced. Nagkakaroon ng bagong potential, action potential, which is adjacent to where the original action potential occurred. So, dito siya, sa kabila niya lang, nagkaroon na ulit ng action potential. So, the action potential is conducted along the axon cell membrane. So, axon na. So, site of the next action potential. So, this becomes the site of the next action potential. Saltatory conduction. So, this is saltatory conduction. Action potential conduction in myelinated axon. Saltatory conduction speeds up the action potential along the axon. So, that is what we call saltatory. Ito siya. Di ba meron tayong node of Ranvier? Ang node of Ranvier, actually, siya yung nag-aano sa Schwann cell, di ba? Nag-separate. In here, the action potential, which is itong orange na ito, at the node of Ranvier, generates current. So, nag-generate siya ng current. Yung black arrow, yun siya yung direksyon ng current. The local currents flow to the next node of Ranvier because the myelin sheath of the Schwann cell insulates the axon of the internode. Di ba gina-insulate siya kasi myelinated siya. Next is in here, as you can see, di ba yung action potential to the next na node of Ranvier. When the depolarization caused by the local current reaches the threshold at the next node of Ranvier, a new action potential is produced. So, nagbalik siya, dito naging negative ulit, pero nag-move siya, nagkaroon siya ng bagong action potential. Then, action potential propagation is rapid in myelinated axons because the action potentials are produced at successive nodes of Ranvier from first to fifth instead of at every part of the membrane along the axon. This is now the direction of action potential. Kumbaga pa, halimbawa magkakaroon ng receptor, sensor receptor, yung paglipat ng potential, action potential from one node to another na pag-travel niya. The synapse. A synapse is a point of contact between two neurons. Dalawang neurons nagkaroon ng contact. So, that is what we call synapse. Or between a neuron and another cell such as a mast cell or gland cell. An action potential arriving at the synapse causes the release of neurotransmitter from the presynaptic terminal. Okay, saan yung presynaptic terminal? Sa end ng neuron, di ba meron doong presynaptic terminal? Okay, which diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds to the receptors of postsynaptic membrane. Okay? So this one, the synapse. So ito yung synapse. A synapse consists of the end of a neuron. Yung end ng neuron, which is a presynaptic terminal. So this is the presynaptic terminal, ang end ng neuron. Ang postsynaptic membrane, dito na yun siya sa may cell membrane, a postsynaptic membrane of another neuron or an effector cell, such as a mast cell or gland, for example. So, meron siya dyan. Okay? Or sometimes yung sarcolemma, kung sa mast cell siya. So, that is your postsynaptic. as a muscle or gland. So, for example, ang action potentials arriving at the presynaptic terminal cause voltage-gated calcium channels to open. Actually, naano naman natin ito yung sa last na discussion sa may muscular system. So, once nagkaroon na ng once na itong voltage-gated channel ng calcium nag-open, so magpasok na dito yung ating calcium, yung mga molecules, no? It will enter into this dito sa may presynaptic na terminal dito ng ating neuron. Dito sa loob. Ang calcium will diffuse into the cell. It will diffuse into the cell and causes synaptic vesicle to release. So, ang mga synaptic vesicle, magre-release siya. Mag-release ang synaptic vesicle to release neurotransmitter molecules. So, mag-release siya ng neurotransmitter molecules. So, dito na nag-enter. Okay, this one. 1. Tapos 2. Okay. Tapos, ang 3 naman dito, the neurotransmitter molecules diffuse from the presynaptic terminal across the synaptic cleft. So, this one here, ang tawag natin dito, synaptic cleft again, yung between the presynaptic terminal at saka postsynaptic membrane is a synaptic cleft. So, dito na-diffuse na yung neurotransmitter molecules. Then, neurotransmitter molecules combine with their receptor sites. So, kung saan siya pwede, to the receptor site. Sites and cause chemically gated sodium channels to open. So, yung chemically sodium channels mag-open, then sodium ions diffuses into the cell. So, mag-diffuse siya doon sa cell, as we can see here in our illustration, and causes a change in membrane potential. So, nagkakaroon na siya ng change in membrane potential kasi dapat itong sodium dyan lang siya. Pero pumasok siya sa loob. So, nagkaroon ng changes in the membrane potential. So, that is for the synapse when we talk about synapse. What are our neurotransmitters? Mga neurotransmitters, we have the substance, ang site of release, ano ang effect, ano ang mga clinical example. So, ang substance, for example, ang neurotransmitter natin is the acetylcholine, which is, ma-abbreviate natin as ACH. Acetylcholine, yung site of release niya, saan niya gina-release? Doon sa may CNS synapse. So, CNS synapse, for example, ito yung synapse natin, no? Okay? Nangyayari doon sa between the membrane at saka sa may presynaptic terminal. Sa ANS, autonomic nervous system, at saka sa neuromuscular junction. Ano ang effect niya pag mag-release ng acetylcholine? Nagkakaroon ng excitatory or inhibitory. So, ma-excitatory or excite or ma-inhibit or masap. Ang example, ang clinical example nito, Alzheimer disease, this is a type of senile dementia. Yung makalimutin ka na talaga, no? Is associated with a decrease of acetylcholine secreting neurons. So, nag-decrease na yung acetylcholine na secretion na neurons. Then, myasthenia gravis. Tawag natin myasthenia gravis, the weakness of skeletal muscle results from a reduction in acetylcholine receptors. So, pwede yung Alzheimer's because ang Alzheimer's nag-decrease yung acetylcholine secreting neurons. Ang myasthenia gravis yung pag-weakness ng skeletal muscle because of the reduction of the acetylcholine receptors. Okay? Next, you have the norepinephrine or the NE. So, actually, itong mga substances na ito magpamilyar dapat kayo nito sa kanila. Kasi from time to time, parang ma-encounter nyo pa rin ito in your higher level. Yung mga, ano itong norepinephrine or the NE. Selected, ang kanyang site of release, selected CNS synapses and some autonomic system, nervous system synapses. Excitory. Okay, ipa-excite niya. Example, ang clinical example, cocaine and amphetamines increase the release and block the reuptake of the norepinephrine, resulting in overstimulation of postsynaptic neurons. Serotonin, CNS synapses, generally inhibitory. It involves with mode, anxiety, and sleep induction. Levels of serotonin are elevated in schizophrenia. Ano yung schizophrenia? Yung may sakit sa brain, no? Yung sakit sa we call this 1 hour term, parang buang. So, siya, delusions, nagkakaroon ng delusions, hallucinations, and withdrawal. Drugs that block serotonin transporters such as Prozac are used to treat depression and anxiety disorders because yung ang serotonin niya is nag-elevate yung kanyang serotonin. Dopamine, ano itong dopamine? Selected CNS synapses and some ENS. Excitory or inhibitory. Parkinson disease, depression of voluntary motor control. Yung Parkinson, yung parang seizure ka na hindi makontrol, uncontrolled shivering, results from destruction of dopamine secreting neurons. So, pag nasira yung dopamine secreting neurons nyo, so wala nang nagakontrol. So, yung mga nerves mo parang nagkakaroon na ng hindi mo na siya makontrol. Gamma aminobutyric acid or GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid. In the CNS synapses, inhibitory. Drug that increase GABA functions have been used to treat epilepsy or excessive discharge of neurons. Glycine in the CNS synapses, inhibitory. Glycine receptors are inhibited by the poison, strychnine, increases the excitability of certain neurons by blocking their inhibition. Strychnine poisoning results in powerful muscle contraction and convulsions. Tetanus of respiratory muscles can cause death. Endorphins, descending pain pathways, inhibitory. The opiates, morphine and heroin bind to endorphin receptors on presynaptic neurons and reduce pain by blocking the release of neurotransmitters. So these are the neurotransmitters. Ito na siya. Next, let's proceed to the reflexes. So, a reflex is an involuntary reaction. Involuntary meaning hindi natin control. In response to the stimulus applied to the periphery and transmitted to the CNS. So, reflex arch are the functional units of the nervous system. Ang reflexes allow a person to react to stimuli more quickly. Okay? Mag-reflex ka, bigla ka na lang or biglang, for example, ano na reflex? Pag halimbawa, tinapunan ka ng bagay patungo sa mata mo, di ba, what will be the reflex? Parang bigla kang mag-blink. So, that's reflex. Reflex arch is the basic functional unit of the nervous system because it is the smallest, simplest pathway capable of receiving a stimulus and yielding a response. A reflex arch generally has 5 basic components, ang arch, no, reflect arch. First, it has a sensory receptor, a sensory neuron. In some reflexes, it has interneurons, which are neurons located between and communicating with two other neurons. So we call that one as interneurons. A motor neuron, and an effector organ, or ang ano ito ng mga effector organ, so pwede siyang muscles or the glands. The simplest reflex arch do not involve interneuron. So walang kasama doon ang interneuron. Most reflexes occurs in the spinal cord or brain stem rather than in higher brain centers. So nag-occur lang ito sa may spinal cord at saka sa brain stem. So hindi na siya nakarating doon sa higher brain centers. One example of a reflex occurs when a person's finger touches a hot stove. Pwede rin siya. Kanina iba yung example ko. So kung halimbawa, 'di ba, kung may stove na mainit, hindi mo alam na mainit siya. Tapos i-touch mo siya, pag na-feel ang init, ano kaagad? The heat stimulates the pain receptors in the skin. So merong mga pain receptors sa ating skin, na pag-aralan natin yun sa skin. And action potentials are produced. So anong action potentials na produce? Nag-exchange automatic, di ba sa kanina sinabi natin mga 2 seconds lang, nagkakaroon ng abrupt na action potentials na produce. Sensory neurons conduct the action potentials to the spinal cord, where the synapse with interneurons. The interneurons in turn synapse with motor neuron in spinal cord that conduct action potentials along their axons to flexor muscles in the upper limb. So these muscles contract and pull the finger away from the stove. So i-ano mo kaagad, di ba? Pag touch mo, away from the stove kaagad. So that is reflex. No conscious thought is required. So, hindi mo na kailangan ng conscious thought na i-require mo na. Pag, halimbawa, mainit siya, pag touch mo, sabihin mo, ay, mainit pala siya. Tapos, hindi mo ginatanggal yung kamay doon. Pero, it's automatically, inaalis mo because there is no conscious thought required for that reflex. And withdrawal of the finger from the stimulus begins. No? Mag-withdraw ka doon sa stimulus mo. Before the person is consciously aware of any pain. Before ka pa nakaramdam na merong pain, na ipalayo mo na yung finger mo. Tapos later mo na, di ba kung minsan, later mo na mapifeel talaga yung pain na yon. Because that is one way of producing ng reflexes. Involuntary kasi siya na reaction pag merong stimuli. Let's look at the neuronal pathways. Ay, hindi pa. Reflect arts muna tayo. So, this is the reflect arts. The part of the reflex are labeled in order in which action potentials pass through them. The 5 components are the sensory receptor, then sensory neuron, interneuron, then motor neuron, and effector organ. So, ano yung organ na effector? So, whether it's a muscle, pwede siyang muscle or the gland. Simple reflex arcs have only 4 components because the reflex does not involve interneuron. So, kung simple lang siya na reflex. So, for example, in here, ano ang una-una? Siyempre, sa sensory receptor. Dito sa may part ng skin. So, pag na-touch niya yan, travel yun siya kasi di ba merong neurons doon. So, it will be traveled. So, dito sa may, ano ang maka-recognize sa kanya? The sensory neuron. Then, you have here the ganglion. Then, ipo-forward siya dito sa may interneuron. Okay? Then, from that interneuron, babalik siya sa motor neuron. So, ang motor neuron, if you are going to look at that nerve na yan, papunta siya away. So, pag ang motor neuron na mag-response, so nagkakaroon ng effector organ. So, the skeletal muscle, yun siya yung kanyang response. So, this is yung reflect arch. Ayan. Neuronal pathways. Neuronal pathways are either converging or diverging. In a converging pathway, two or more neurons synapse with the same postsynaptic neuron. Okay? This allows information transmitted in more than one neuronal pathway to converge into a single pathway. In a diverging pathway, the axon from one neuron divides and synapses with more than one other pro-synaptic neuron. So, tingnan natin mamaya ito sa may ating figure. So, spatial, we have what we call the spatial and temporal summation occur in neuronal pathways. Within the CNS kasi, and in many PNS synapses, it takes more than a single action potential to have an effect. Kailangan, it takes more than single action potential. A single presynaptic action potential usually does not cause a sufficiently large postsynaptic local potential to reach threshold and produce an action potential in the target cell. Instead, many presynaptic action potentials are needed in the process called, ito na yung tinatawag natin na summation. Summation of signals in neural pathways allows integration of multiple sub-threshold local potentials. Summation of the local potentials can bring the membrane potentials to threshold and trigger an action potential. While ang mayroon tayong dalawang summation, pag sinabi natin spatial summation occurs with the local potential originate from different locations on the postsynaptic neuron. For example, from converging pathway. Ang temporal naman na summation occurs when local potentials overlap in time. So this can occur from a single input that fires rapidly, which allows the resulting local potentials to overlap briefly. Spatial and temporal summation can lead to stimulation or inhibition depending on the type of signal. Collectively, this integration of multiple inputs determines whether the postsynaptic neuron will fire an action potential. So this is converging and diverging pathways in the nervous system. So this one here, as you can see, the general model of the converging pathway, showing two neurons converging onto one postsynaptic neuron. As you can see here, yan. So this is the cell body of another one. So presynaptic axon. Then, the direction of action potential, papunta doon sa kanyang cell body. Then you will have your postsynaptic axon. From one neuron to another. So, converging. So, dalawa sila. Ibig sabihin yung dalawa, two or more na neurons will converge or will just go sa pathway ng isang neuron, no? Postsynaptic neuron. Pero ang diverging naman is baliktad siya. General model ito naman of the diverging pathway, showing one neuron, isang neuron, diverging onto two postsynaptic neurons. So, isang neuron siya, mag-diverge siya doon sa dalawang neurons. Okay? Yung kanyang pathway. So, that is converging. Kung converge, dalawang neuron papunta sa doon sa isang neuron na postsynaptic neuron. Then, ang diverging from one neuron going to two postsynaptic neuron. So, yun siya yung pathway ng converging at saka diverging in the nervous system. So let us now look at the anatomy na tayo ng isa-isahin na natin, tingnan yung mga central and peripheral nervous system. So as just like what we have mentioned kanina, the CNS consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the PNS consists of the nerves and the ganglia outside the CNS. So na-mention natin as mentioned previously. So the brain is housed within the brain case. Yung brain na yan, naka-house siya sa brain case, while the spinal cord is in the vertebral column. So sa PNS naman, since it consists of the nerves and the ganglia outside the brain and the spinal cord, the PNS again collects information from numerous sources both inside and on the surface of the body and relays it, hindi release ha, i-relay by way of sensory neurons to the CNS, where one of three results is possible. So, pwede yung mangyayari ganito. The information is ignored. Na-mention na natin, triggers a reflect, magkakaroon ng reflect, or is evaluated more extensively. So, hindi pa siya, kasi kung mag-reflex ka, automatic ka agad mag-action. Pero kung ano pa siya, evaluate siya more extensively, parang later on pa yung action niya. So, motor neurons in the PNS relay information from the CNS to muscles and gland in various parts of the body, regulating activity in those structures. The nerves of the PNS can be divided into two groups. So, dalawang grupo. It could be 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Meron siyang 12 pairs ng cranial nerves and 31 pairs of the spinal nerves. Okay? Sa PNS, kasi mga nerves siya. 12 pairs sa cranial, at 31 pairs sa spinal nerves. Let us look at now our spinal cord sa CNS, no? Before tayo magpunta sa brain. Let's discuss first yung ng CNS at saka PNS. The spinal cord ng CNS, so kung sa PNS siya, syempre, kung nasa spinal cord, mga spinal nerve roots na siya. The spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum at the base of the skull to the second lumbar vertebrae. As ipakita natin mamaya, nag-extend siya sa ating figure. The spinal nerves communicate between the spinal cord and the body. The inferior end of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves exiting there resemble a horse tail, no? Parang nag-resemble siya ng horse tail and are collectively called the cauda equina. Ang spinal cord has a central gray part organized into horns and a peripheral white part forming nerve tracts. Roots of the spinal nerves extend out of the cord. Okay, ito siya yung spinal cord and spinal nerve. So this is our level of a foramen magnum. Dito sa may part na yan, sa foramen magnum. So ang foramen magnum is at the base of the skull. So this is our cervical. Ilan ba yung cervical? Hanggang 7, no? C7. So from C1 hanggang dito na tayo. Okay? Coccygeal nerve. Sa coccyx. So ito siya na portion from that L1 to in here na end. We call this one now as our cauda equina. This is now the level of the second lumbar vertebrae. So the L1. So, yung mga spinal nerves, roots niya, anchor dito sa nakakonect siya dito sa may spinal cord. So, kasi itong spinal cord, so from the brain, dadaan dito sa spinal cord. So, maraming dito ng spinal nerves. So, depende kung ano yung siyang mga reactions na kanyang dito siya ipapadaan sa spinal nerves na yan. So, this is a cross-section of a spinal cord. Pag mo yung spinal cord, i-cross-section, putulin mo siya. In each segment of the spinal cord, rootlets, so it has rootlets combined to form a dorsal root on the dorsal, meaning posterior side, and a ventral root on the ventral or anterior side. So, this is our central canal, okay, sa spinal cord. So, this one here, this is a white matter. Ito na yung white matter natin. This is the gray matter ng spinal cord. So, sa white matter, ito yung dorsal column. This is the dorsal column ng white matter. Then, this is the ventral column ng white matter, lateral ng column ng white matter. So, in the gray matter, we have what we call the posterior horn, the lateral horn, at saka anterior horn. So, in this spinal cord, you have the dorsal root. Okay? Dorsal root. The dorsal root ganglion, the spinal nerve. So, ito na yung mga spinal nerve. So, sa ventral root, ito yung mga rootlets niya. Itong mga maliliit na yan. So, that is rootlets. So, ito yung ventral. Okay, dalawa yan siya. Kasi yung spinal cord natin, meron siyang dalawa na side na na mga spinal nerves, naka-connect, left and right. So, ito yung kanyang part if we are going to look at the cross-section of the spinal cord. So, ito yung ating makikita. Cross-section of the spinal cord. Another cross-section ng spinal cord. Relationship of sensory and motor neurons to the spinal cord. Ano ang relationship niya? So, you have that color. Meron siyang color na green. So, ano itong green? Ibig sabihin nito is yung sensory mo, di ba? Okay? So, this is the sensory neuron. Ito naman is the interneuron. So, dalawa kasi, di ba, ang sa motor neuron, it's either autonomic or the somatic neuron. So, kung autonomic, ito siya yung sa blue. Okay? This one here is ating purple or blue ba purple sa may somatic. So, this is the ventral root, the anterior horn, posterior horn, lateral horn, okay? So, this is our white matter, so the gray matter. So, dito, pag nagkaroon na ng response from that sensory sensory na receptors, pupunta siya sa sensory neuron, pero papunta siya doon sa may gray matter. Converging and diverging pathways in the spinal cord. In a converging circuit, a sensory neuron from a periphery, yung green, by way of an interneuron block, and a descending neuron from the brain, purple, converge on a single motor neuron, which is the purple. Okay? Converging. Okay? Kung nag-converge siya, this is an example of converging. Meaning to say, mag-converge siya. Ano yung converging? Ilang cell sa converging. Yung dalawang neurons, mag-converge siya doon sa one postsynaptic neuron. So, this one is here. So, dalawa, nag-converge siya. Okay? Then, ito na yung kanyang response. From the brain, punta na doon. So, converging. Ito naman, diverging. Converging, isang ano lang interneuron. Sa converging naman, ito, dalawa na. Okay? In a diverging circuit, a sensory neuron from a periphery diverges and sends information to a motor neuron by way of an interneuron, which is black, and sends information to the brain. Yan. So this is the pathway of the converging and diverging. So spinal cord reflexes. The knee jerk. Pag nag-jerk yung knee mo, reflex occurs when the quadriceps femoris muscle is stretched. Pag stretch mo. The withdrawal reflex removes a body part from a painful stimulus. So ito yung knee jerk reflex. So may mga ano 'di ba tayo dito, yung mga neurons natin, sensory receptors. So, ang sensory receptors will connect to the sensory neurons. So, to the brain. Then, from the brain, magkakaroon ng motor neuron. Yan. The knee-jerk reflex is an example of a stretch reflex whereby the stretching of muscle stimulates the same muscle to contract. Yung pareho pa rin na muscle yung mag-contract. For example, ang sensory receptor in the muscle detect stretch of the muscle. Na-detect niya nagkaroon ng stretch dito sa muscle. So in here, sa femoris, quadriceps femoris. Then, ang sensory neurons conduct action potential to the spinal cord. So magkakaroon siya ng action potential papunta doon sa may spinal cord. The sensory neuron synapse with motor neurons. So mag-synapse or mag-connect siya doon sa may motor neurons. Descending neurons. So yung descending neurons is the black. Within the spinal cord, also synapse with the neurons of the stretch reflex. So nagkakaroon ng stretch reflex dito. And modulate their activity. Next in here na sa may motor neuron, stimulation of motor neurons causes the muscle to contract and resist being stretched. So, nag-resist siya na ma-stretch siya. So, this is a knee-jerk reflex. Knee-jerk reflex, again, is the simplest reflex. Na reflex. Yung stretch na reflex. Ang stretch reflex occur when muscles contract. Yun na nga. So this is knee-jerk reflex. This one is the withdrawal reflex. So in here, sa 1, yan. Dito nag-start, no? Sa knee-jerk. Dito naman sa may withdrawal, ito siya. Ang stimulus dito. The withdrawal reflex moves a body part away from a painful stimulus. Pain receptors detect a painful stimulus. For example, ito na ano ka ng lansang. Okay, di ba? Natusok. Natusok ng lansang. So, this withdrawal. Ang next is, anong mangyayari? From here, okay, it will travel to the sensory neuron. So, sensory neuron conduct action potentials to the spinal cord. And in here, the sensory neuron synapse with interneurons. Or mag-connect siya doon sa may interneurons that synapse with the motor neuron. Mag-synapse sa motor neuron. Excitation of motor neuron dito, neurons results in contraction of the flexor. Mag-contract yung flexor muscles and withdrawal of the limb from the painful stimulus. Yan. Okay? From that, ito siya, halimbawa, ito na yung ating sensory neurons. Siya yung makasense ng pain. Okay? To travel doon. So, pag anong response doon ng ating part of that spinal of our CNS. So, yun siya yung gagawin niya na action. So, ang neuromuscular junction dito, so anong mangyayari? Mag-reflect yan siya or ang flexor muscles and the withdrawal limb of the limb from the painful stimulus. So, spinal nerve. So, after the spinal cord, we have the spinal nerves. The spinal nerves exit the vertebral column. So, nag-exit siya doon sa vertebral column at the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, at saka sacral regions. Alam naman natin ito, C1 to 7, T1 to 12, L5, at saka sa sacral region. The nerves are grouped into plexuses. Tingnan natin yung kanyang grupo ng ating spinal nerve. So we have the cervical plexus, we have the brachial plexus. Tingnan natin ano yung kanyang mga divisions or ang kanyang mga grupo. Okay? The phrenic nerve, which supplies the diaphragm, is the most important branch of the cervical plexus. The brachial plexus supplies nerves to the upper limb. Okay, siya yung nag-supply. The lumbosacral plexus supplies nerves to the lower limb. So yung nag-supply supply nerves to the upper limb is the brachial plexus. Sa lower limb is the lumbosacral plexus. So these are the plexuses and dermatomal map. So nerves of the spinal cord, the regions are color-coded para mas matandaan natin. Dermatomal map of the body. Letters and numbers represent the spinal nerve innervating a region. So, yung mag-supply. So, may mga color ha. So, meaning to say, kung blue ito yung mga ginaano niya. Ito yung part na kung saan dito yung mga plexuses niya. Okay? For example, the cervical. Bakit hanggang 8 nito? So, C, okay? Cervical plexus. So, that is C from C1 to 4. Ang brachial plexus is from C5 to T1 hanggang dito. Okay? Hanggang dito. To T1. Ang naman, thoracic, di ba, cervical nerves. Thoracic nerves. So, ito yan, ang ka-color niya yan. So, you have there the dura mater. Okay? This one naman is the lumbar nerve. Okay, lumbar plexus, L1 to 4. Lumbosacral plexus. Sacral plexus, coccygeal plexus from S5 to CO. Coccygeal nerves, sacral nerves, lumbar. So, ang ibig sabihin nito, ito yung map, okay, of the body na kung saan ang plexus niya. Okay, yan. This is anterior and the posterior. Alam natin yan ha, meaning, doon siya sa T. Halimbawa, ito siya, di ba, T1. So, from here, ang ikanyang magiging, tawag nito, ang mga nerves niya from the spinal cord, this T1, for example, T1, di ba, spinal cord, tapos meron ka mga spinal nerve na ito, it will proceed to, yung responsible niyan, for example, dito mo kinurot, dito na portion. So, the T1, so it will be for the T1. Hanggang dito, T1 yan siya. So, halimbawa, ka dito naman na portion, this is T2, T1. So, may mga kanya-kanya siyang may mga spinal nerve in this part of the body. So, kaya yung tinatawag natin ito na dermatomal map. Okay? Yan. So, color-coded siya. Malalaman mo na dito siya na portion, cervical plexus ba siya, or the brachial plexus ba siya, or the lumbosacral plexus, or the Okay, tandaan ninyo, marami kang i-memorize na C2 dito. Meaning ang C2, this is the cervical. So this one here, ito yung responsible dyan. Okay? Yan, C3, C4. Dito yon sa lumbar na portion, L1. Tapos L2. Okay? L1, L2, hanggang sa lower limb and the upper limb. So yan. Plexuses of the spinal nerves. Ito na ang ating summary dito sa table. So you have the plexus, ang kanyang origin, ang major nerves niya, muscle innervated, and skin innervated. Meaning yung nag-supply, no, saan siya mag-supply with the nerves. Cervical, for example, from C1 to C4, major nerves niya is the phrenic. Ang innervated siya, several neck muscles, and tsaka sa diaphragm. Ang sa skin naman is sa neck and the posterior head. So kayo na ha, mag-study ng table. Okay? The plexus, origin, major nerves, the muscle innervated, and the skin innervated. Now, let us proceed to, tapos na sa parang inisa natin no, sa CNS. First, yung sa spinal cord niya. And the spinal nerves is for, then, yung sa spinal nerves niya. Nerve ng spinal cord. Okay? Then, the brain. So, ang brain is divided into, okay, ang brain, may mga regions, ang brain, there are four major regions of the brain stem, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, at saka the cerebrum. So, isa-isahin natin ito. So, ang brain is this one. Regions of the right half of the brain. Medial view of a mid-sagittal section of the right half of the brain. So, this is anterior, at saka this is the posterior because this is mid-sagittal section. So, this one is our cerebrum. Okay? This is our diencephalon. And this is our brain stem. This is the midbrain. And this is our cerebellum. Okay? Madali lang tandaan. This is cerebrum, diencephalon, the brain stem, and the cerebellum. So, isa-isahin natin siya. Isa-isahin natin yung divisions or major regions ng brain. Let's start with the brain stem. Ang brain stem connects the spinal cord to the remainder of the brain. No? Sa remainder ng brain. It consists of so syempre ang brain stem contains the several nuclei. Ang brain stem consists of medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. So tingnan natin dito ulit ha. So this is our brain stem. So ang brain stem, we have here, part ng brain stem is the midbrain, the pons, at saka medulla oblongata. So this brain stem connects the spinal cord to the remainder of the brain. So ito siya nag-connect. So spinal cord na kasi sa baba nito. So na yan. Then, the medulla oblongata sa ng brain stem contains nuclei that control activities such as heart rate, breathing, swallowing, and balance. So dito sa may brain stem, dito na portion sa may medulla oblongata, yun na nga ang halimbawa, ano yung kinakontrol niya. So this is ang medulla oblongata is the most inferior portion ng brainstem and is continuous with the spinal cord. So, nag-continuous na siya sa spinal cord. It extends from the level of the foramen magnum to the pons. No? Extends dito sa pons. Okay? Ang sa baba niya, spinal cord, sa taas niya is the pons. The medulla oblongata contains ascending and descending nerve tracts, which convey signals to and from other regions of the brain. Siya yung nag-convey ng signals to and from other regions of the brain. So, ano pa yung ibang mga regions niyan? Okay? Napag-usapan natin. In addition, the medulla oblongata contains discrete nuclei with specific functions, such as, for example, yan na nga yung binasa natin kanina, nandyan sa ating slide. Nag-regulate siya ng heart rate. Okay? Kung nag-labdab ang heart rate mo or nag-slow mo. So, that is, ang nag-regulate niyan is the medulla oblongata. And blood vessel diameter. So, mag-shrink or mag-dilate yung blood vessel. Breathing, kung tayo ay humihinga yon, yung medulla oblongata yung doon, yung function niya. Even, for example, nag-swallow tayo, okay? Or nag-vomit, kasama na doon, hindi ko nasulat. So, vomiting, coughing, sneezing, balance, mga color and coordination. So, yun siya is the medulla oblongata. The one that control those activities is the medulla oblongata. Again, ang heart rate, ang breathing, swallowing, vomiting, coughing, sneezing, balance and coordination. The one that controls that, again, is the medulla oblongata. What about the pons? Kasi yung brainstem, di ba? Merong first, yung sa pinakababa na nag-connect sa spinal cord is the medulla oblongata. Next to that, ang sa sunod is the pons. Immediate superior ng medulla oblongata. It contains ascending and descending nerve tracts, as well as several nuclei. Some of the nuclei in the pons relay information between the cerebrum at cerebellum. So, nag-relay siya between the cerebrum, D1, cerebrum, nag-relay siya ng message, and the cerebellum. Not only is the pons a function bridge between the cerebrum at saka cerebellum. So, parang bridge siya ng cerebellum at saka cerebrum. But on the anterior surface, yung anterior niya, it resembles an arch footbridge. Arch footbridge. Saan ito dito? Mamaya tingnan natin dito. Wala pa. Sa kanyang So this one. Okay? This is the pons. So it has that arch footbridge. So several nuclei of the medulla oblongata, okay, yung dinescribe natin earlier, extend into the lower part of the pons. Yung several nuclei ng medulla oblongata naga-extend in the lower part of the pons. So, functions as breathing also. Kasi nag-extend siya doon sa pons, it also functions as breathing, swallowing, and balance. So, kinokontrol din doon sa lower pons, okay? Kasi siya sa connect na siya doon sa may medulla oblongata, as well as in the medulla oblongata, doon din, di ba? Other nuclei in the pons control functions such as chewing and salivation. So, kung nag-chew ka at saka nag-salivate, okay? Kasi kasi yung pagkain na nakikita mo masarap masyado, so nagsalivate ka, hindi ka naman binigyan. So the other function of the pons is that for chewing and salivation. And lastly, the last major regions of the brain stem, which is the midbrain. So ang midbrain is just superior to the pons, right? And is the smallest region of the brain stem. Siya yung pinaka-smallest region ng brain stem. Ang dorsal part of the midbrain consists of 4 mounds called the coniculi. The 2 inferior coniculi are major relay centers for the auditory nerve pathways in the CNS. The 2 superior coniculi are involved in visual reflexes. Yung dalawa is for the auditory, yung dalawa naman na superior, yung inferior is for the auditory, ang superior coniculi is for the visual reflexes and also receive touch and auditory input. Turning the head toward a tap on a shoulder, for example, gitap ka ng shoulder, mag-turn ang head mo, a sudden loud noise, okay, marinig mo yung sudden na loud noise, or a bright flash of light is a reflex controlled in the superior coniculi of the midbrain. The midbrain contains nuclei involved in coordinating eye movements. So, sa eye movements and controlling pupil diameter and lens shape. So marami siyang involvement. The midbrain also contains a black nuclear mass called the substantia nigra. Okay? The substantia nigra, which is part of the basal nuclei and is involved in regulating general body movements. The rest of the midbrain consists largely of ascending tracts from the spinal cord to the cerebrum and descending tracts from the cerebrum to the spinal cord or the cerebellum. So, nandito, what I am talking about, nandito ang ating summary, okay, for the brain stem. So, reticular formation is scattered throughout the brain stem and is important in regulating cyclical motor functions. So, yung cyclical motor functions, it is also involved in maintaining consciousness and in sleep-wake cycle. So, this is all for the brain stem, the medulla oblongata, the pons, at saka the midbrain. Next, of the parts of the brain, okay, is what we call the regions pala of the brain. We're done with the brain stem. Parts of the brain stem is the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Another major regions of the brain is the diencephalon. So, diencephalon is the part of the brain between, saan siya makikita? Between the brain stem at saka the cerebrum. So, balik tayo dito. So, brain stem. So, this is your diencephalon. Diencephalon. It is between this is the brain stem. Okay? Kasama yung midbrain na yan. Brain stem and the cerebrum. Ito yung cerebrum natin. So, sa gitna niyan is the diencephalon. Its main components are the thalamus and hypothalamus. Actually, meron pa siya ditong tinatawag na epithalamus sa gitna niya. Thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. Pero actually, itong dalawa kasi yung talagang mas alam natin kasi yung epithalamus hindi masyado siyang nagagamit. Okay? So, that is diencephalon. So as you are going to look at this one now, brain stem and the diencephalon. So this one here na portion, this is the anterior view of the brain stem. Kung tingnan natin yung brain stem, okay, balik tayo doon sa ating figure. Yan. Okay, ito. Ang anterior niya is this one, the anterior view ng brain stem. So, anterior view ng brain stem is ito siya. Okay, from here. So, you have the midbrain, the pons, at saka yung medulla oblongata. Yan. This is naman here, this is the posterolateral view. The inset shows the location of the diencephalon, which is red, and the brain stem blue. Dito ito. Red ang diencephalon. So, tingnan natin itong inset na ito, nakasaloob. So, this is the brain diencephalon. This one is the brain stem. Ito, posterior lateral view. So, kung posterior lateral, ito na yung diencephalon natin na portion. Okay? This one naman is the midbrain. The pons. So, under the pons, you have the cerebellar pedicels. Okay? This is now the medulla oblongata. So, this is the parts of the brain stem and diencephalon. Next, if we are going to look at this one here in the diencephalon, ang sa diencephalon kasi nandoon ang thalamus, di ba? Ang thalamus is the largest part of the diencephalon. Pinaka-largest part ng diencephalon, yung thalamus. It consists of cluster of nuclei. Kung tingnan natin, and is shaped somewhat like a yo-yo. No, parang yo-yo siya. With two large lateral part. Dalawang part niya. Connected in the center of small interthalamic adhesion. So, dito, meron siyang interthalamic region dyan. So, we can see that one in here. Kung diencephalon ang titingnan natin. So, this one is the interthalamic adhesion. So, this is the thalamus. So, thalamus yan siya, which is the largest part of the diencephalon. Most sensory input that ascends through the spinal cord and brain stem projects to the thalamus. So, from that brain stem, pupunta yun siya sa may thalamus. And within the thalamus, ascending neurons synapse with thalamic neurons. So, mag-synapse or mag-connect yun siya sa thalamic neurons. So, if you are going to look at this one now, so, this is thalamus. This is your hypothalamus of your diencephalon and the epithalamus. Okay? So, in the epithalamus, a small area superior and posterior to the thalamus. Okay? It consists of few small nuclei, which are involved in yung epithalamus actually, involved in the emotional and visceral response to odors and the pineal gland. Ang pineal gland naman is siya? Ito yung pineal gland. Nasa epithalamus siya. Pineal gland is an endocrine gland. So, pag-usapan natin yung endocrine gland. Kasama doon ang pineal gland that influence the onset of puberty. So, yung nagpa-puberty, ito siya. And may play a role in controlling some long-term cycles that are influenced by the light-dark cycle. In animals, the pineal gland is known to influence the yung behaviors. Such as, for example, yung annual behavior ng mga animals, the migration in birds, di ba, nag-migrate sila, as well as the changes in the color and density of the far in some mammals. So that is in the diencephalon. So makikita natin yan siya. Ito na yung mga parts ng diencephalon, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So this is a diencephalon. Okay? So for the hypothalamus is the most inferior part of yung pinakababa na part ng diencephalon. It consists several small nuclei that are very important in maintaining homeostasis. So nag-maintain ng homeostasis. The hypothalamus plays a central role in the control of body temperature, hunger, and thirst. So kung nagugutom ka, yung body temperature o nauuhaw ka. Sensations such as sexual pleasure. Okay? Yung mga sexual pleasure na yan. So, ang hypothalamus ang play a very important role. That rage, kung galit ka, fear, takot ka, and relaxation after a meal are related to hypothalamic function. No? Kung halimbawa, kumain ka, so mag-relax, so that is hypothalamic function. Even emotional responses that seem inappropriate to circumstances, such as yung nervous perspiration or emotional eating, also involve hypothalamus. So yung mga sa emotions mo din, so sa hypothalamus. Yung feeling mo, nasa hypothalamus. So I love you with all my hypothalamus. Okay? So yung naka-feel ka ng may mga feelings mo, sexual pressures, yun ay sa hypothalamus, hindi pala siya sa heart. So kaya, I love you with all my heart, hindi na siya. I love you with all my hypothalamus. A funnel-shaped stalk, infundibulum. So meron tayong infundibulum. So ito siya, parang funnel shape. Extends from the floor of the hypothalamus. So, nag-extend siya sa hypothalamus. To the pituitary gland. So, meron siya, yung pituitary gland. So, this is the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus plays a major role in controlling the secretion of hormones. Ang hypothalamus din, kasi dito yung pituitary gland, plays also a major role in controlling the secretion sa pag-secrete ng mga hormones from the pituitary gland. So we are going to discuss that one sa chapter 10, yung endocrine system sa mga pituitary gland, about the pituitary gland. The mammillary bodies. So we have the mammillary bodies. Ito siya. Form externally visible swellings on the posterior portion of the hypothalamus. The mammillary bodies are involved in emotional responses to odors and in memory. So, yun siya. Okay? So, that is about our diencephalon. Next, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is attached to the brain stem. Cerebellum is cerebellum pa lang tayo, no? It's not the cerebrum. Cerebrum pala tayo sa cerebrum. Cerebellum muna tayo pala. Cerebellum is attached to the brainstem. Yung pagka-arrange ko actually ng aking cerebellum, going back. The cerebellum is attached to the brainstem by several large connections called the cerebellar peduncle. These connections provides routes of communication between the cerebellum and other parts of the central nervous system. The structure functions of the cerebellum, i-discuss natin in motor functions later, yung sa cerebellum. So, kung minsan, tinatawag natin itong cerebellum as little brain. Okay? Tingnan ninyo. Okay? Kasi parang, di ba ito parang brain na ito siya, parang brain din siya. Parang little na brain niya naman. Pero that is cerebellum. And that is attached to the brain stem. Next is the cerebrum. Ang cerebrum, it has two hemispheres. Each divided into lobes. Ang hemisphere na yan, the frontal lobe, the parietal, the occipital, at saka temporal lobes. And the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. So it is divided into left and right hemisphere. So two hemispheres, the left and the right. So tingnan natin, ito siya. So this is cerebrum. So hemisphere niya, left and right. So this is a superior view. So this is the left hemisphere and that is the right hemisphere. Then it is divided into 4 lobes. So ito yun siya. Central sulcus, yun siya yung mayroong division na yan. So we have the parietal lobe. So this one here. The occipital lobe. And you have the frontal lobe. Okay? Pero yung isang lobe na yan, sa pangita, yung ang temporal kasi superior kasi siya, so hindi makita natin yung temporal na lobe. So dito naman na portion, ito na. So you have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, at saka sa temporal na lobe. So if you are going to look at this one, these are the fissures, okay? And the sulcus, ito yung naga-divide sa sa ating mga lobe ng ating brain. So the lateral fissure, ito siya lateral fissure, yan siya. Okay? Ito, lateral fissure. Naga-divide yan siya dyan. Ang central sulcus, ito naman. Okay? So, mag-divide siya sa central, sa frontal lobe at saka sa parietal. Sa occipital. So, this is the lateral view of the left cerebral hemisphere showing the lobes. Okay, yan? So, this is now our cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. Okay, yun lang ang ating information. So we have, for example, ang frontal lobe is important. Ano yung ang role ng frontal lobe? So sa frontal lobe is important in the control of voluntary motor functions. So yung mga voluntary motor functions, this is sa my frontal lobe. Motivation, for example, aggression, mood, and olfactory smell reception. So that is frontal, ha? In voluntary motor functions. Sa voluntary motor functions, ano yung mga voluntary motor functions natin? Ang motivation, aggression, mood, at saka olfactory, the smell. The parietal, ito yung parietal. The parietal lobe is the principal center for, ano ito siya? Receiving and consciously perceiving most sensory information. Yung mga sensory information, dito siya sa may parietal lobe. Ano na mga sensory information? Such as, for example, pag magkaroon ng may touch, pain, temperature, tapos balance, okay? Ang frontal at saka parietal lobes are separated by the central sulcus. Ito na nga. Okay? Occipital. Itong occipital lobe naman. Ang occipital lobe functions in receiving and perceiving visual input and is not distinctly separate from the other lobes. So, hindi mo siya masyadong ma-distinct na separate sa other lobes. Pero ang kanyang function is for receiving and perceiving visual input. So sa visual, doon yun siya sa may occipital lobe. And the temporal, so this is the temporal lobe, is involved in olfactory also, sa smell. And auditory, hearing. Kasi di ba malapit naman siya kasi sa may ears natin. Sensation. And plays an important role in memory. So yung memory. Pag nag-malfunction yung memory mo, meaning to say, sa temporal mo, merong problem. Its anterior and inferior portions called the psychic cortex ng ating temporal are associated with functions such as abstract, thought, and judgment. So pag merong mga judgment, abstract thought, that is temporal. Most of the temporal lobe is separated from the rest of the cerebrum by lateral fissure. So yun siyang nag-separate sa kanya, yung lateral fissure, ito siya. And deep within the fissure is the insula. Kung tingnan natin doon sa loob talaga ng fissure is the insula, which is often referred to as the fifth lobe. Although wala naman talagang fifth lobe, pero nandoon yun siya. So these are the lobes of the cerebrum, which is the largest part. So may kanya-kanya silang role, di ba? Yung mga sa ating brain. So let's proceed to the sensory functions. The CNS, or the central nervous system, constantly receives sensory input. So siya palagi yung nag-receive ng sensory input. So we are aware of much of the input, but it is vital to our survival. We are unaware. So, hindi tayo masyadong aware na nagkakaroon ng input palagi doon sa ating sa CNS. Pero, it is very vital to our survival. No? Kasi, bakit? Kasi siya yung nag-maintain ng homeostasis. So, kasi tayo, normally, hindi natin alam kung nagtaas talaga ang ating blood sugar or baba yung ating blood sugar unless na magpa-laboratory tayo. Pero yun doon siya yung nagagawa ng paraan para magkakaroon ng homeostatic level or nagiging equal yung distribution noon sa ating katawan. Or even ang temperature, ang blood pressure doon. So it is very vital to our survival. And some sensory inputs results in sensation. So, syempre, nagkakaroon tayo ng ating sensation. The ascending tract. Ano ang ibig sabihin ng ascending tracts? Meaning paakyat, no? From the periphery to the brain. That ascending tracts, yung itong tract na ito yung dadaanan natin. Transmit actions potential from the periphery to the brain. Meaning, from the PNS to the CNS, yun siya ascending yung tawag doon. Kasi di ba ang ating CNS sa taas naman talaga. So, papunta yun sa taas. So, each tract carries a specific type of sensory information. So, sa bawat na tract na yon is may kinicarry siya na kanyang sensory information. Each specific type. So, this is the table showing the ascending tracts. So, ang pathway, so we have the sphenothalamic, the dorsal column, and the spenocerebellar, the anterior and the posterior. So, dito, ang function naman ng sphenothalamic is for pain, temperature, light, touch, pressure, tickle, itch, sensations. Dorsal column, proprioception, touch, deep pressure, and vibration. The spinocerebral biliar is the proprioception to the cerebrum. So, yan siya yung kanyang mga functions. So, that ascending tract, tingnan natin yung kanyang ascending tract of the spinal cord. So, ascending tract pathways, itong green na ito, are labeled on the left side of the figure only, though it exists on both sides. Naga-exist dito, meron din siya, pero ito lang yung ating ito lang yung labeled So this is the dorsal column. This is the posterior spinocerebellar tract. The anterior spinocerebellar tract, okay? And this is the anterior spinothalamic tract. So this one here, pa-ascending. So tingnan natin yung ano natin sa pag ano na information. Okay? Ascending papunta ng taas. So this is the dorsal column. The dorsal column transmits action potentials dealing with touch, position, pressure. Lines on the inset indicate levels of section. So this is the receptor, the first neuron pathway. So this is the dorsal column, the spinal cord. Then this is your medulla oblongata, the second neuron pathway in pathway, then sa pons, then sa midbrain, then papunta ng thalamus. So this is the third neuron in pathway. So this is your cerebrum. Somatic sensory cortex. So from in here, so dito ay yung first na neuron in pathway. So sa may dorsal column ng spinal cord. So kung mag-ano siya, paakyat siya, so syempre akyat yun siya. So meron siyang level. Ito first, second, and this one here. Dito na yung third. Okay? Ito yung pathway niya. The dorsal column transmit actions potential. So yan siya pag mag-transmit na siya ng action potential. Sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. Ascending tracts project two primary sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. Association areas are involved in recognizing the sensory input. Sensory and motor areas of the lateral side of the left cerebral cortex. Sensory and motor areas are indicated by different colors. Notice the body areas associated with specific regions of the primary motor cortex and the primary sensory cortex. Okay, sa lower limb ito, trunk, upper limb, sa may head. So this is the central sulcus, yung pag-separate niya. So primary somatic sensory cortex, this is the somatic sensory association area. Sensory speech area dito, which is the Wernicke area. This is the visual cortex. This is visual association area. In here, taste area beneath the surface in insula. Okay? Auditory, dito naman ang auditory association area. This is the primary auditory cortex. Motor speech area, this one. Prefrontal area, premotor area, premotor cortex. So naka color-coded sila based on their sensory and their motor area. So sensory at saka sa motor areas. Somatic motor functions. Somatic motor functions includes pwede siyang involuntary, pwede siyang voluntary movements. Ang somatic motor functions, the upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex connect to lower motor neurons in the spinal cord or cranial nerve nuclei. Okay? Upper motor neurons. Motor areas of the cerebral cortex. Upper motor neurons are located in the primary motor cortex. The premotor and prefrontal areas regulate movement. Sila yung nag-regulate ng movement. So, for the descending tract, so kung meron tayong ascending, meron tayong descending tract. Descending tracts project directly from sa upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex to the lower neurons in the spinal cord and the brain stem. So, just review lang ha, from time to time, yung inyong mga figure. Sa figure lang kayo magbase dito sa ating summary. Indirectly, they project basal nuclei. the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex through the brain stem to lower motor neurons in the spinal cord. Okay? Descending, pababa naman ito na tracks. So this is the descending tracks. Yung pathway niya, direct at saka indirect. Sa direct, the lateral corticospinal at saka anterior corticospinal. Ang indirect, the rubrospinal, the reticulospinal, vestibulospinal at saka tectospinal. So ito na yung mga functions ng ating descending tract. So yan. So ito naman, so kanina yung sa ascending, di ba iba-iba ang kanila. Itong yung naka-highlight ng green is the ascending. So doon yung kanyang dadaanan. So descending, ito naman na track yung kanyang dadaanan. So descending tracks of the spinal cord, descending pathways, itong naka-purple, are labeled on the left side of the figure only, although exist in both sides. Nag-exist siya. Ito na yon, lateral corticospinal, rubrospinal, anterior corticospinal, reticulospinal, vestibulospinal. This is the tectospinal. Dito, for example, from the brain, dadaan siya dito. So kung galing siya sa brain, dito siya sa dadaan. Pero kung galing siya sa mga sensory receptors, dadaan siya doon sa green kanina, remember ninyo, doon sa may ascending. So doon yung kanyang daanan. So these are the tracks of the descending tracks. Example of a direct track. The lateral corticospinal tract is responsible for movement below the head. Lines on the inset indicates levels of section. So yung mga lines, yan siya yung, lines niya, levels ng section niya na. Sa level ng section, this one. So this is the lower motor neuron, upper motor neuron. Okay? So meaning to say, pag nasa descending track siya, yun ay ang motor neuron niya na, di ba? Kasi mag-ano na siya ng actions. Ang sa ascending is sensory. Isi-sense niya papapunta. So this one here. So from the motor cortex, pababa na ka na midbrain, upper motor neuron pons, pyramid, medulla oblongata, the spinal cord. This is the lower motor neuron. So this is now going to the neuromuscular junction. So this is for the direct track. Next, basal nuclei. Ano naman itong basal nuclei? So basal nuclei are group of functionally related nuclei. So there are two primary nuclei are the corpus striatum, located deep within the cerebrum, and the substantia nigra, a group of darkly pigmented cells in the midbrain. So basal nuclei help plan, organize, and coordinate motor movements and for the posture. People with basal nuclei disorders exhibit increased muscle tone and exaggerated, uncontrolled movement when at rest. Kung meron siyang basal nuclei disorders. So this one here, the basal nuclei are functional grouping of nuclei, important to coordinating movement and maintaining postures. Ito na. So you have the corpus striatum at saka the substantia nigra. So in the midbrain. Makikita siya sa midbrain. So this is your thalamus, okay, in the diencephalon. So this is your basal nuclei. Cerebellum. So balik tayo sa cerebellum, no? Okay? Ang cerebellum. The cerebellum is involved in balance, muscle tone, and muscle coordination. Actually, ko na kanina ito. Through its comparator function, the cerebellum compares the intended action to what is occurring and modifies the action to eliminate differences. If the cerebellum is damaged, muscle tone decreases, the fine motor movements become very clumsy. So kung very clumsy ka, meaning to say there is something wrong with your cerebellum. Cerebellar comparator function. The cerebellar ensures smooth and coordinated skeletal muscle movement by comparing intended movement with sensory information from actively moving body parts. So ito na siya. This is your motor cortex. Ipa-follow lang natin ang ating diagram. So sa 1, dito sa may 1, the motor cortex sends action potential to lower motor neurons in the spinal cord. Dito sa 2, action potentials from the motor cortex inform the cerebellum of the intended movement. Kung ano ang dapat niyang i-move na intended na movement. Dito sa may 3, in here, lower motor neurons in the spinal cord send action potentials to, isisend niya yung action potential sa skeletal muscles causing them to contract. Then, dito sa may 4, di ba nag-contract na ito? So this is the proprioception signals from the skeletal muscles and joints to the cerebellum convey information concerning the status of the muscle and the structure being moved during contraction. Isisend niya dito sa may cerebellum. Then in here, the cerebellum compares the information from the motor cortex. Ano niya, kung ano ang kanyang information. With the proprioceptive information from the skeletal joints. So doon sa may skeletal joints. Dahil lang ha. Then, saan na tayo? 6. Okay? Sandali lang. 6. Action potentials from the cerebellum to the spinal cord modify stimulation from the motor cortex to the lower motor neuron. So, ito na siya. Modify niya. Then, in here now, pag na-modify, going to the thalamus, okay? So, sa 7, action potentials from the cerebellum are sent to the motor cortex to modify its motor activity. So, i-modify niya na ang activity. So, this is the cerebellar comparator functions. So, again, proprioception, ibig sabihin, na-mention ko na last time, yung parang perception mo or awareness mo of the position or of the movement of the body. So, other brain functions, of course, communication between the right and the left hemispheres. So, yung left and right hemispheres ng cerebrum natin, there is that communication. Speech, okay? Nagkakaroon ng speech. For example, sa communication between the right and the left hemisphere. The right, okay, brain waves and consciousness, memory, limbic system, and emotions. So, communications between the right and left hemisphere. So, each hemispheres controls the opposite half of the body. So, di ba na-divide yung ating cerebrum sa left and right. So, ang ginakontrol ng left hemisphere at saka ng right hemisphere, yung half din ng ating body. Commissures connect to hemispheres. The left hemisphere, so ang left hemisphere ng ating brain is thought to be the dominant analytical hemisphere. So, which is nag-analyze, okay, so that is sa left. Ang right naman hemisphere is thought to be dominant for spatial perception at saka musical ability. Okay? Kung sa mga musical ability, ang ating right na hemisphere. So kung medyo parang mga analytical yung person na yon, so that is left hemisphere ang nag-dominate. Kung, for example, spatial, okay, yung kanyang spatial or musical na ability, pag spatial or musical ability naman siya, nasa right naman siya na hemisphere. Okay, tandaan ninyo, left and the right hemisphere. So may kanya-kanya silang kinokontrol. Pero usually, in terms of the control ng ating left and right, okay, na mga activity, kung halimbawa ang control natin is sa left, usually pag left na hemisphere, ang affected is the right part of the body. Pag left hemisphere, that is sa right. Okay? So, kung ang left hemisphere, kung analytical siya, meaning to say, emphasizing, kung analytical, ano na mga analytical, such as for example, skill mo sa mathematics, tapos sa speech, yun siya yung mga analytical, no, sa left na hemisphere. So bright, yung mga bright na ginaano natin, meaning, so yun siya. Pero kung kung sa right involves yung mga yung sinasabi na natin, yung mga activities, no? Mga activities. Yung mga magaling ka sa ganito, mga skill. So that is right yan siya. So for the speech, kasi ito yung iba pang mga functions ng ating brain. So communication left na hemisphere, yung affected na area is the right na area ng body. Sa left na hemisphere is sa right naman, or right hemisphere sa left naman na body. Then also another function is for the speech, no? Involves the sensory speech area, the motor speech area, and the interaction between them and other cortical areas. So in most people, the speech area is in the left cerebral cortex. So sa left cerebral cortex, two major cortical areas are involved in the speech. Yun na nga, the sensory speech area at saka the motor speech area. So the motor speech area, or we call that one also as the Broca area, located in the frontal lobe. Okay, sa frontal lobe. Controls the movement necessary for speech sa frontal lobe. Damage to these parts of the brain or to associated brain regions may result in aphasia. Aphasia, A-P-H-A-S-I-A. Meaning, kung meron kang damage dito sa certain na sa may frontal lobe, absent or defective yung speech or language mo, or language comprehension. Hindi ka masyadong maka-speak. So that is aphasia. So the most common cause of aphasia is a stroke. So kung magkakaroon ka ng stroke, then sa frontal lobe na ang na-damage, then that will make you na kung saan hindi ka masyadong maka-speak. So that is aphasia. It is estimated that 25 to 40% of stroke survivors exhibit aphasia. So yung nag-exhibit sila ng aphasia. Ang speech-related functions involve both the sensory and motor pathways. For example, to repeat a word that you hear involves the following sequence of event. So, halimbawa, nakarinig ka ng word, tapos i-repeat mo yung word. So first, nagkakaroon ka ng action potentials from the ear. Diba? Doon sa ear mo, kasi narinig mo. Reach your primary auditory cortex, where the words is perceived. So narinig mo yun Then after that, the word is recognized in the auditory association area, and the comprehension in the portion of the sensory speech area. Then, nagkaroon ng action potentials representing the word are then conducted through nerve tracts that connect the sensory and motor space in the motor at saka sensory speech areas. In the motor speech area, yung muscle activity needed to repeat the word is determined. Then, nagkaroon na ulit ng action potentials, then go to the premotor area where the movements are programmed. Then finally, action potentials are conducted to the primary motor cortex where specific movement are triggered. Speaking a written word, for example, ito, binabasa ninyo, involves a slightly different pathway. Kasi nag-speak ka, then while you are also reading. So, the information enters also the visual cortex. Iba yung pag narinig mo, okay, sa iyong area nyo ng ano mo, doon naman sa ear, di ba? Kasi yun siya ay naka-reach ng iyong ear. Pero kung speaking a written word, binabasa mo ito tapos sabihin ko, for example, speech involves the sensory speech. So, information enters the visual cortex, then passes to the visual association area, where it is recognized. So, the information continues to the sensory speech area, where it is understood and formulated as it is to be spoken. From the sensory speech area, it follows the same route for repeating words that you hear, through nerve tracts to the motor speech area, to the premotor area, and then to the primary motor cortex. So we have here the brain waves and the consciousness. An EEG, or we call that one as the electroencephalogram. Electroencephalogram monitors brain waves. Sa brain naman natin. Okay? Iba yung ECG, iba rin ang EEG. Pag sinabi na EEG, it monitors your brain, which are summation of the electrical activity of the brain. So, malalaman kung ano yung ginagawa doon. So, different levels of consciousness can be revealed by different patterns of electrical activity in the brain. So, we use ang machine na ginagamit natin para malaman natin yung electrical activity of the brain is the EEG, electroencephalogram. So, this is how it looks, yung electroencephalogram, patient with electrodes attached to her head. So this is electroencephalogram for electroencephalographic tracing. So we have here, kasi mag-reflect, di ba? Ano na siya, monitor ng EEG. So meron siyang 4 na waves or electroencephalographic tracings. We have the alpha waves, beta waves. Ito yung itsura ng alpha waves. So baka later on, as a nurse, di ba kayo man yung nag-file ng mga laboratory tests. So pag makakita kayo ng mga waves na ganito sa test ng lab result ng EEG, it is, kung ganito yung kanyang itsura, that is alpha waves, this is beta waves, theta waves, at saka delta waves. So each wave ng brain is meron siyang ibig sabihin. The intensity and the frequency ng brain waves differ. So the different levels of consciousness in an awake and a sleeping person are marked by different types of brain waves. So for example, ito alpha waves. Ito siya, nagaganito yung kanyang wave na makikita. So alpha waves are observed in a normal person who is awake. Awake ka, but in a quiet, resting state with the eyes closed. Awake ka, pero nakapikit yung mata mo, so ganito yung magiging wave mo. So that is alpha wave. Ang beta waves have a higher frequency. Tingnan natin yung mabilis yung frequency niya than the alpha waves and occur during intense mental activity. So kagaya ngayon, nakikinig kayo ng mabuti or absorb ninyo yung mga pinag-uusapan natin dito. Intense mental activity. And during the beginning of sleep, a rapid transition takes place from a beta rhythm to an alpha rhythm. So kung halimbawa bigla kang mag-rest ka, so nagkakaroon ng transition. As sleep deepens, progressively more delta waves occur. So itong delta. Wala pa tayo sa theta ha. Itong delta, halimbawa, 'di ba, grabe ang mental activity mo. Tapos bigla kang aware ka pa pero napagod ka, so conscious ka pero nakapikit yung mata mo. So nag-alpha waves ka. Pero later on, as sleep deepens, as habang parang natutulog ka ng deep na yung sleep mo, naga-progress. So this becomes the figure. So this means that delta waves occur during deep sleep in infants, for example, or in patients with severe brain disorders. Okay? So sa mga infant or sa mga merong severe disorders, nagkakaroon ng delta waves makikita. Then lastly, itong theta waves. Theta waves are usually observed in children, but they can occur in adults who are experiencing frustrations or who have certain brain disorders. So sa mga children, kasi active yung mga children, no? Nagkaroon sila ng theta. Pero sa mga adults, pag mayroon silang nafe-feel, so malalaman kung frustrated ka pag gamit ng EEG, okay? Pagtingin, ganito yung wave na makikita, frustrated ito siya. Or meron siyang mga disorders. Neurologists use these patterns to diagnose and determine the treatment for the disorders. Ito yung kanilang pattern na tinutingnan para malaman nila kung ano yung disorders. Next function of the brain is for the memory. So when we say memory, the storage of memory can be divided into 3 stages. Working memory. So kung pag sinabi nating working memory, lasting a few seconds to minutes. Ang short term, lasting a few minutes, and long term, syempre from the word long, memories can also permanent or na memory, ang long term. Hindi siya matanggal-tanggal sa iyo na memory, so that is long-term memories. So long-term memories can be subdivided based on the type of memory. Those dealing with facts. So, yung long-term, nag-deal ka ng facts, that is declarative. And those dealings with skills, that is procedures. So, kung mga facts yung gina-deal mo, or procedure. So, the brain briefly stores information required for the intermediate performance of tasks. This task-associated memory is called working memory. Kasi may pinapagawa lang sa'yo. And kung nagalast siya ng few seconds to minutes, of course, mostly in frontal cortex. Sa frontal cortex siya. Working memory is limited primarily by the number of bits of information, about 7, that can be stored at any one time. When new information is presented, old information previously stored in working memory is eliminated. What happens to a telephone number, you just look up if you are distracted. For example, memorize ka ng cellphone number mo, 0917. So, short memory lang siya. So, habang na-memorize mo siya, biglang may pumasok na bagong information, nalo-lost mo yung last mo na memory na ngayon lang, tapos nare-replace ka agad siya ng bago na naman na memory. So, that is working memory. What about yung short term? Kasi lasting a few minutes. Ang short-term memory lasts longer than working memory. Can be retained for a few minutes. Pwede mo siyang ma-retain for a few minutes or even mga days. Ang short-term memories are stored by a mechanism involving increased synaptic transmission Ang short-term memory is susceptible to brain trauma. So, pwede siya magkaroon ng brain trauma such as physical injury or decreased oxygen and to certain drugs that affect neural functions such as general anesthesia. So, yung palaging ne-inject ng general anesthesia, yung short-term memory niya, pwede yon siya. Yung mga short-term memory lang, yung ngayon lang, naalala mo, pero pagka ilamipas na mga buwan, nakakalimutan mo. So, yung long-term memory naman is somewhat may pagka-permanent yung long-term memory. Kasi sometimes, yung short-term memory na yon, pwede siyang matransferred to the long-term memory. So, sana short-term lang ito, pero nagta-transfer siya where it may be stored for only a few minutes or become permanent by consolidation, a gradual process involving the formation of new and stronger synaptic connections. The length of time memory is stored may depend on how often it is retrieved. Kung paano mo siya ba palaging ginagawa. For example, sa long term, at saka kung paano mo siya, kailan mo siya ginagamit. Kung palagi mo siyang ginagamit from time to time, so it becomes a long term. Okay? So, ang short term, for example, may pinapagawa sa'yo na menu, nagluto ka. So, yung menu na yon, alam mo, adobo. Halimbawa, ikaw ay hindi marunong magluto. So, binigyan ka ng information ng adobo, na magluto ka ng adobo. So, ganito ang gawin mo, ganyan, ganyan. So, pag ginawa mo na yan, nagkaroon ka ng short-term na memory. Pero hindi mo siya ginawa inaraw-araw or hindi mo na siya ginawa for a long period of time, so nakakalimutan mo siya. Nagiging short-term memory siya. Pero pag from time to time, weekly, nagluluto ka ng adobo, ganun na procedure, ganun, nagiging long-term memory na siya or nagiging permanent. And because that is procedural, so that is procedural memories. And ang memory natin, kung declarative naman or explicit memory involves the retention of facts. Such as, for example, ang names ng kapitbahay mo, na memorize mo siya, na retain. First, nag-transfer ka ng bahay, ang name ng kapitbahay mo hindi mo pa masyadong kilala. So, inask mo yung name. Then, from time to time, nakikita mo siya. So, naalala mo always yung kanyang pangalan. Diba? Or, for example, ang date. Ang date ng inyong anniversary ninyo. Okay? Ng lalabs mo. So, alam mo yun talaga. Pero pag halimbawa kinalimutan mo na siya ng todong-todo, so nakalimutan mo na siya, nagiging short term siya. Yung places, okay? Yung date, for example, ang example ng date talagang long term talaga siya kasi yung birth date mo, syempre, hindi mo nakakalimutan. Or some birth dates ng iyong mga mahal sa buhay. Di ba, hindi mo siya kaagad nakakalimutan. Nagiging long term. Ang places, yung mga lugar. So, nagiging, nagiging, maalala mo siya always. So, that is declarative. No? Names, dates, places, declarative memory yan ng long term. Emotion and mode apparently serve as gates in the brain and determine what is stored in long-term declarative memory. Okay? Procedural yun na nga, or procedural or reflexive memory involves the development of your motor skills. For example, nag-ano ka ng bicycle, motorin siya. So, una-una ng bike, hindi ka marunong. So, until such time, palagi mo siyang ginagawa, so hanggang naalala mo na siya. Okay? Yung mga basta inuulit-ulit mo siya. So, pwede siyang magiging short to a long-term memory. So, limbic system and emotions. So, limbic systems and emotion. The limbic system includes the olfactory cortex, deep cortical regions, and nuclei. The limbic system involved with memory, motivation, mood, and other visceral functions. Olfactory stimulation is a major influence. So this is our limbic system. includes the olfactory cortex, the cingulate gyrus, an area of the cerebral cortex on the medial side of each hemisphere, nuclei such as those of the hypothalamus and thalamus, a mass of neuron cell bodies in the temporal lobe, and connecting nerve tracts such as the fornix. So this is the fornix, the cingulate gyrus. Okay, yan. So this is the limbic system. Next, we are going to discuss about the meninges. Okay. Meninges. There are 3 connective tissue meninges cover the CNS. Yung naga-cover sa meninges. The dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So this is our meninges. Ito yung naga-cover sa ating it covers and protects and surround the brain and the spinal cord. So meninges yung tawag natin sa kanya. So yan, dura mater. Ito yung dura mater. This is the arachnoid mater. At yung sa pinakaloob niya is dito is the pia mater, arachnoid mater. So yung tatlo ang ating mga meninges. So meninges, sila yung nag-cover sa ating brain at saka sa spinal cord. Meningeal membrane surrounding the spinal cord. The dura mater, ito na, the subdural space. Then, next is the arachnoid mater, the subarachnoid space, then the pia mater. So, this is the dorsal root ganglion. This is the spinal nerve and the ventral root. So, meninges, cross-section of a vertebra and a spinal cord. So, ito na yon siya. Kung it is the posterior, and this is the anterior. So, again, going back here sa ating meninges, itong dura mater is the most superficial and the thickest of the meninges ng ating tissue membranes. So, the dura mater around the brain consists of 2 layers which function as a single layer but are physically separated into several regions to form dura folds. So, actually, ang role ng dura mater, yung meninges natin, is covering siya ng brain. So, pag na-damage yung covering ng brain, possible na madadamage yung ating brain or the spinal cord. So, it's very important na mayroon yun, mayroong meninges. We call that one as meninges. Ventricles, the brain and spinal cord contain fluid-filled cavities. The lateral ventricles in the cerebral hemisphere, a third ventricle in the diencephalon, a cerebral aqueduct in the midbrain, a fourth ventricle at the base of the cerebrum, and a spinal canal in the spinal cord. The fourth ventricle has openings into the subarachnoid space. So this is a ventricles of the brain viewed from the left. The ventricles that contain cerebrospinal fluid produced by the coronoid plexuses. So this is the brain. The cerebrospinal fluid formed in the choroid plexuses in the ventricles. It exists to the fourth ventricle and re-enters the blood through arachnoid granulation in the superior and sagittal sinus. So this is the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid. White arrows indicate the direction of the CSF flow and the black arrows indicates the direction of the blood flow in the sinuses. So I will leave it to you assignment. Please post this video and then try to study the flow of the CSF. Then this is the flow of the CFS pa rin. White arrows indicate the direction of the CSF flow and the black arrows indicate the direction of the blood flow in the sinuses. So still yan, pinaano lang natin. So we have the cranial nerves. there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 3 with only sensory function, S, 4 with only somatic motor function, M, 1 somatic motor, M, and sensory function, S, 1 with somatic motor and parasympathetic function, and 3 with all 3 functions. 4 of the cranial nerves have parasympathetic functions. So cranial nerves are olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. Kindly memorize that mga ano niya. So this one here is the table of the cranial nerves and their function. So you can pause this video to study the cranial nerves and their functions. So this is the inferior surface of the brain showing the origin of the cranial nerves. So meron ka naman doon number, di ba? Alam mo na yan. May nerves, the cranial nerves transmit and relay information to and from the brain. The autonomic nervous system contains preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. The autonomic nervous system has sympathetic and parasympathetic division as we have seen kanina doon sa pinakauna natin na pinag-aralan. So this is the organization of somatic and autonomic nervous system, neurons. The cell body of the somatic motor neuron is in the CNS, and its axon extend to the skeletal muscle. So organization of somatic and autonomic nervous system neurons, the cell body of the preganglionic neurons, so this is the preganglionic neurons, in the CNS, and its axon extend to the autonomic ganglion and synapses with the postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron extend to and synapses with its effector organ. So yan. So this is the table for the synaptic and parasynaptic division of the autonomic nervous system. Kindly study this table also. So this is the innervation of organs by the ANS. Preganglionic fibers are indicated by solid lines and postganglionic fibers are indicated by dashed lines. So kindly also study this one. Nakaano naman, nakakonect. Yon. So yun siya yung kanyang innervation or pag-supply ng with the nerve. So anatomy of the sympathetic division. Preganglionic cell bodies of the sympathetic division lie in the thoracic and upper lumbar region of the spinal cord. Postganglionic cell bodies are located in the sympathetic chain ganglia or in the collateral ganglia. Preganglionic cell bodies of the parasympathetic divisions are associated with some of the cranial and sacral nerves. Postganglionic cell bodies are located in the terminal ganglia, either near or within target organs. Autonomic neurotransmitters. All autonomic preganglionic and parasympathetic postganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine, and most sympathetic postganglionic neurons secrete norepinephrine. So na-mention na natin yan siya. Functions of autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic division prepares a person for action by increasing heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and release of glucose for energy. Parasympathetic division is involved in involuntary activities at rest, such as the digestion of food, defecation, and urination. So this is the effects of the autonomic nervous system on various tissues. So you have the target, the sympathetic effects, and the parasympathetic effects. So this table, you can post again and please study. Enteric nervous system, we also have what we call the enteric nervous system, forms plexuses in the digestive tract wall. So sa digestive tract, itong enteric nervous system. Enteric neurons are sensory, motor, or interneurons. They receive CNS input but can also function independently. So, ang enteric nervous system in the digestive tract wall, makafunction siya independently. What will be the effect of aging on the nervous system? In general, sensory and motor functions decline with age. So, habang tumatanda, nag-decline yung sensory at motor. Okay? Parang nabibingi ka o yon. Mental functions, including memory, may decline with age. So, makalimutin ka na, but this varies from person to person. Pero may mga person naman talaga na kahit matanda na, good pa rin yung memory. So, these are the representative diseases and disorders of the nervous system. So, kindly pause this one and study the condition and what will be the description. So, you have the CNS na disorders at saka the PNS disorders. And lastly, this is the system interactions. Kung ang isang person ay nagkakaroon ng stroke, a stroke can have a negative effects on many areas of the body. The diagram illustrates how the system of the body are affected following the stroke. So dito ko malalaman ngayon kung kayo talaga ay view ng video na ito or nakikinig because there are those na nililivit ko sa inyo na basahin. Just like for example, for this one, please read the interaction of the other systems with regards to the stroke. So this ends our nervous system na organ system na discussion. But if you have further question, you may ask questions through our Google Room, GCR, or you can also refer to other videos sa YouTube ng nervous system na mas pinakomprise siya or other na mga references for your study also. You help also yourself. Again, you review, you study this video for our quizzes and our exams. So this ends our